Menachem Begin, the sixth Prime Minister of Israel, the commander of the pre-state Irgun, the man who established and led the parliamentary opposition for 29 years, defending a vibrant liberal democracy, who led a national liberal revolution in Israel, including policies of social justice and a free market, who acted to safeguard Israel, destroying Iraq's nuclear reactor, the man who signed the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state, changing the Middle East forever. The Menachem Begin Heritage Center is a state institution with responsibility for preserving the legacy of Menachem Begin, a leader of principle and rare integrity. Here are 5 facts about the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. 1. The center houses an interactive multimedia museum that reviews Menachem Begin's life and educates about the values he believed in. 2. The center is home to a comprehensive archive comprising documents and historical records covering every chapter of Menachem Begin's extraordinary life. 3. The center's education department provides services to a diverse target audience in Israeli society and around the world. 4. The center offers a variety of cultural and intellectual lectures and events that take place on a weekly basis and deal with the fields of the Jewish people, Zionism, Jewish thought, Israeli society, and regional affairs. The lectures are also broadcast online and are watched by tens of thousands of viewers throughout the world. 5. The center hosts historical and educational tours of its unique surroundings and stunning views, which overlook the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, as if bridging the gap between past and present. We invite you to be a partner in our goal of continuing the legacy of Menachem Begin, his values and ideals, his love for the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and his commitment to the principles of liberty, democracy, social justice, and equality. His story is our journey.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends from around the world, it is my honor and my privilege to be speaking to you all from the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. Since we opened the doors of the Begin Center 17 years ago, we have welcomed over 1.5 million visitors through our doors. We have held public events, programs, and seminars for soldiers, high school students, academics, and others. Our mission has been to educate about the life and legacy of Menachem Begin, one of the greatest Jewish leaders of the 20th century. And in recent years, Begin is appreciated by more and more people, and we see his image enhanced year on year. Now, we have decided to continue to the next stage of this mission, the Begin Symposium, which will be an annual event, brings the legacy of Menachem Begin to an international audience, to our brothers and sisters in the diaspora. This year, and in future years, we will be looking at how to apply Begin's idea and values to the challenges facing Israel and the Jewish people today. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers for you, and I believe each one will teach you something about Menachem Begin and how he continues to inspire Israelis and Jews throughout the world. This year, we are also holding the symposium the day before the 40th anniversary of Operation Opera, Israel's bombing of the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq. It was one of the Begin's most important decisions as Prime Minister, and this anniversary serves to remind us of Begin's worldview, which took threat to the Jewish people seriously, his absolute commitment to Israel's security, and his decisive and principled leadership. My friends, I look forward to next year's symposium, when we will be able to welcome you here in Jerusalem in person. And now, I present the 2021 Begin Symposium. Let's begin.
Hello, I am Malcolm Hoenlein, and I am pleased to co-chair this first Begin Symposium. It is a pleasure to welcome the participants from around the world to this symposium, which is an important component of the Begin Legacy Initiative, which also includes Upheaval, the remarkable first English-language documentary on the life of Menachem Begin. I truly feel honored that I had the privilege to know, to work with, and to benefit from Menachem Begin, and was able to spend quality time with him. Beyond being a political figure, he was a unique personality who was a role model in integrity and morality, and made so many sacrifices for the Jewish people and the Jewish state throughout his life. This symposium, which is virtual unfortunately this year due to COVID, will be having its in-person debut next March in Jerusalem at the Begin Heritage Center. I look forward to sitting and talking with renowned author Daniel Gordis and going into depth on the life and contributions of Menachem Begin. This abbreviated virtual symposium today will be recorded, and its purpose is to examine Menachem Begin, the leader, and the policy issues he dealt with at his time, which are as relevant to us today as then. When we look at a nuclear Iran emerging, we remember the remarkable courage he had in executing Operation Opera, which marks its 40th anniversary this year. As we witness attacks on Israel and the sinister rise of global antisemitism, the lessons we can learn from the life of Menachem Begin can serve to guide us and our leaders today. Please enjoy the symposium and the remarkable speakers who have gathered today to participate. And I thank all of those who helped make it possible, and especially Rob and Simon Schwartz. Enjoy the symposium.
היה זה בחורף תש"ט, כאשר ראיתי אותו לראשונה בחיי, כאשר נכנס לבית החולים החלמה של פצועי האצ"ל בירושלים, כל זאת בווילה אגיון, שהוא ברחוב בלפור ברחביה, ושלימים הפך להיות מעונם הרשמי של ראשי ממשלות ישראל. מנחם בגין היה מפקדו הנערץ של הארגון, דמות אגדית בעיני פיקודיו חייליו. כולם שנכנסו לבניין וכולם עמדו דום. רוב הנוכחים ראו אותו אז לראשונה בחייהם, אחרי שנים בהם היה איש מסתורין, לוחם מחתרת. לראשונה הם עמדו מול מנחם בגין פנים אל פנים לאור היום, ולא ידעו את נפשם מרוב התרגשות. בגין, לבוש חליפה, ענוב עניבה, מלווה באמי עליה שלום רחל, ניגש אל כל אחד ואחד מהפצועים בהחלמה, עבר מלוחם ללוחם, חיבק, ליטף, עודד ודיבר דברי נועם. הוא דיבר אליהם כאב אל בניו, מרעיף עליהם אהבה אין קץ. חלקם הזילו דמעות של התרגשות למראה המפקד, המנהיג, הנערץ, שיצא מהסללים וניצב לפניהם בשר ודם. בצד עמדתי אני הקטן, אז בן 9.5, משתאה, תוהה, כיצד ייתכן שהאיש המהודר והעדין, כן, לא גבוה במיוחד, ובעל דיבור רך, הוא דמות המסתורין של ילדותי. מי שתמיד דימיתי אותו לבר כוכבא או ליהושע בן נון. הייתכן שאלתי את עצמי שגם הם אולי היו עדינים ונחמדים משאני מדמיין אותם היום. כשמבקשים ממני לתאר את תמצית מורשת בגין, אני רואה בעיני רוחי מנהיג שערג יחד, בשלמות, את היהודי ואת הדמוקרטי. הדמוקרטי והיהודי, הלאומי, הליברלי, לאומי ללא פשרות וליברלי ללא פשרות. לוחם למען עמו, המוכן למנוע מלחמת אחים גם אם דמו יישפך. לוחם למען השלום, להגנת מדינתו ולשלמות ארצו. לוחם למען החלשים שבחברה אשר דוכאו ואפילו נרמסו. לוחם למען כבוד העם היהודי שומר חומות ירושלים. דמוקרט, פרלמנטר, העומד על משמר הכנסת, על כבודה, על היותה הריבון כנציגת העם. אופוזיציונר נצחי אשר בסבלנות אין קץ בונה אלטרנטיבה שלטונית. מנהיג המגן על בית המשפט ובלי פקפוק אומר לחבריו הרבים גם בשעות שלא היו נוחות. יש שופטים בירושלים. אדם שהקשיב לקולו של העם ונתן לו להישמע, להשפיע, לנווט את מדינת ישראל. הדמוקרט שכבוד האדם, כל אדם, באשר הוא אדם, היה בנשמתו. אבל בגין, היהודי והדמוקרטי, בדיבור אחד נאמרו. כזה היה האיש. כך פעל בימיו כמפקד האצ"ל, כך פעל כיושב ראש האופוזיציה, כן, וכך פעל כראש ממשלה. בימים בהם נמצאת מדינת ישראל במשבר פוליטי מתמשך, חשוב שנלמד על מורשתו והשפעתו של האיש המיוחד הזה. הייתי אומר האדם המיוחד הזה. האיש ששם את עמו לפני הכל. איש האחריות הלאומית. אז היו ברוכים ובהצלחה.
Okay, thank you to all of our speakers so far, and especially to President Rivlin for such heartfelt words and such a personal take on Menachem Begin. And I think we can appreciate why he chose to speak in Hebrew, to speak so from the heart emotively about Begin. Okay, we after some false starts, we are on, and I'd like to introduce Tamara Behrens, a board member of the Hidden Light Institute, our partners in making this symposium happen. Tamara, are you going to join us? Yes, great. Tamara, you will introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be part of this fantastic symposium, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Hidden Light Institute and the Menachem Begin Heritage Center for inviting me. I'm excited to be chairing a discussion with Yossi Klein Halevi today. Yossi is one of Israel's preeminent writers and intellectuals. He is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdallah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Halevi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. He writes for leading op-ed pages in the US, including The Times and The Wall Street Journal, and is a former contributing editor to The New Republic. And here we have Yossi here. I'll finish reading his bio, and then we'll get right to it. Hello, Yossi. In 2013, he was a visiting professor of Israel Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary and served as a writer in residence at the University of Illinois. He was a senior fellow at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem from 2004 until 2010. Born in Brooklyn, he moved to Israel in 1982. So I wanted to get through all of that because you have such a storied biography and a storied history. And I think it's important to point that out before we begin this discussion. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and encourage you all to think of some questions for Yossi and write them in the Q&A box. We'd really like this to be an interactive discussion. And around the second half of this hour, I will begin taking your questions. So please don't hesitate to ask. But Yossi, thank you again. It's a pleasure to be having this opportunity to talk to you about Menachem Begin.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure and an honor. So thank you, Tamara.
Great. So I'd like to start by asking about your intellectual journey and how Menachem Begin influenced you from the days where, as I'll leave you to describe, you took a very different view of Jewish security and politics to your ideas and your writing today. I'd love to know how Begin influenced your journey and sort of matured with you.
What's missing from the biography that you read, Tamara, is for me one of the most important details, which is Chanich Beitar, a member in the ranks, in good standing of the Beitar youth movement. I joined Beitar, which of course was the youth movement of Jabotinsky and Begin. In 1966, I was 13. It was literally my coming of age as a Jew, as a human being. Beitar shaped me. It shaped my Jewishness, certainly, to this day. And however my politics have changed over the years, and they certainly have, there is a core connection that is unbroken, that links me to Camp Beitar in Neversink, New York, and to the basement headquarters in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn of Ma'oz Beitar in Brooklyn to this day. And whatever my commitments are to the Jewish people have been shaped by Beitar and by a man that I never met, but who is one of the most formative and significant people in my life, and that's Menachem Begin. I never had the privilege of meeting him, but I grew up with Menachem Begin. And, for me, as a Beitari, Menachem Begin and Jabotinsky were almost interchangeable. They were almost the same person. That's scandalous to say for a certain generation. And I think Begin would be the first to say, how dare you? Because Jabotinsky had an absolute unique place in the mythos of Beitar. Jabotinsky, in a way, was like Rebbe Nachman of Breslev, or like the seventh Lubavitcher, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. There was no successor. Yet, I would disagree. I think that Menachem Begin actually was the successor. The only person we ever called Rosh Beitar was Jabotinsky, and yet for me, in a way, Begin was also Rosh Beitar. He so embodied the values of Beitar, the values of certainly determination, of defending the Jewish people, whatever the cost, but doing so with dignity. This, for me, is the crucial Beitar synthesis. You don't only defend the Jewish people to your last ounce of strength, but you do so without ever forfeiting your personal dignity, your dignity as a Jew. That's what I learned from Menachem Begin without ever having met him, but with feeling that Begin, in a way, was my spiritual father.
That's beautiful. I want to delve a bit deeper, and just in case anyone in the audience doesn't know what Beitar is or what it means, perhaps you could explain a bit in your own words, what it meant to be growing up in Brooklyn and be a member of Beitar as opposed to another youth movement, or opposed to not being in a youth movement at all. And if you could give us a bit of that history, that would be great.
So Beitar in America in the 1960s was a fringe movement. There were a handful of us. We knew everyone who was in Beitar. And we were, in some sense, the outcasts of Zionism in those years. Almost all the other Zionist movements were either socialist or pro-socialist. Even Bnei Akiva, the religious Zionist youth movement, was socialist in those years. We were the naysayers. We were the iconoclasts. We believed in an Israel that was capitalist, and I think I think that the Israel of today, startup nation, vindicated the ideology of Beitar in that sense. We believed in the biblical borders of Israel, but in Beitar, the biblical borders were quite generous. It wasn't only Judea and Samaria. That was not anywhere near sufficient. The biblical borders included what is today the Kingdom of Jordan. And I grew up, as we all did in Beitar, with a patch on my uniform of the greater, I would call it greatest Israel, because it wasn't just Judea and Samaria, it also included Jordan, and a necklace. I had a silver necklace with the map of, I would call it the fantasy map of expanded biblical Israel. And I say the fantasy map because when Jabotinsky placed that map on the table in the 1920s and broke decisively with the willingness of the social Zionist movements to compromise territorially, he envisioned many millions of Jews escaping from Europe, coming to these ample borders. And the great tragedy of the Jewish people was that they didn't listen. People did not listen to Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky and Beitar were so precious to me as the son of a Holocaust survivor, because they had been the would-be rescuers. And these ample borders that Beitar envisioned were intended to as a refuge for millions of Jews of Europe, who of course never made it. And so I call them fantasy borders, but I invoke that word really in the most moving, for me, the most moving sense, because these were the borders of our thwarted rescue. These were the borders that represented the redemption, the failed redemption of European Jewry, and of course, for many reasons, no longer became relevant. And I think that even as I was growing up, I understood that these borders had become fantasy borders, but they were precious to me. The symbol was precious to me because it reminded us of who the would-be rescuers of European Jewry were, and it was the camp of Jabotinsky and Begin. It was Beitar. It was the revisionist Zionists. And however much my politics have changed, especially on partition, especially on the future of Judea and Samaria, I nevertheless will always feel this enormous sense of love and gratitude to those who tried to save my family, to those who tried to save the Jews of Europe.
So you mentioned Jabotinsky, and I'd like to talk about him a little more for a moment. The Rosh Beitar, the head of the movement that made Begin the man and Begin the prime minister, they had a fascinating relationship, and you talked about some of the dynamics. But I'd like to ask you specifically about, some of perhaps the differences between them, where they differed, how Jabotinsky fit into Begin's story, but where Begin departed, both personally and perhaps, in his actions as a man of politics. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that relationship.
Well, in a certain way, Begin was far more suited for the state of Israel than Jabotinsky would have been. Jabotinsky was the ultimate pre-state Zionist leader. But Jabotinsky, I wouldn't say Jabotinsky was a man of the people in the way that Begin was. Jabotinsky certainly was not the assimilated Jew that he's often portrayed in much of Zionist discourse, especially in the other camps discourse. Jabotinsky came from a Yiddish-speaking family. He was a warm Jew. But Begin had an extra dimension. There was something about Jabotinsky that was really, Jabotinsky belonged to almost a kind of nobility. Begin belonged to the Jewish people in a much more visceral way. And we saw that with Begin's relationship with Mizrahi Israel. Mizrahim adored Begin. And there were all of these false rumors, of course, that Begin's mother was Moroccan, in the way that there used to be false rumors that Shimon Peres's mother was an Arab. But I think that what that was expressing was that Begin loved the Mizrahim because they were good Jews. The major mistake, I would say the fatal flaw of Mapai, of the socialist Zionists in the early years of the state, was to convey a certain patronizing contempt for the culture of the Mizrahi. They were, quote, the wrong Jews. They were too religious, too patriarchal, they weren't socialist. And Begin saw warm Jews who loved the state of Israel, who were patriots. And who would want better Jews than the Mizrahim? And they felt he was the first Israeli leader who genuinely communicated unequivocal love for Mizrahim. So that's something that I don't know if Jabotinsky, who had that sense of a little bit of an aloof refinement, a sense of, Begin, of course, Begin had that refinement, but he wasn't aloof. And I think that is what Begin was not only a major leader, he was also a politician, and we forget that. Begin was a consummate politician. He managed to keep the right together in opposition for 29 years, an astonishing achievement. There was no revolt against Begin. There was sporadic revolt, here and there, but no real substantive revolt against Begin. And so he was a great politician. He had that touch. You can't imagine Jabotinsky kissing babies. Begin kissed babies. Begin was a great campaigner. Begin was a man of the crowds, of the public square. Jabotinsky was a superlative orator, but always, a little bit removed. So I think that Begin was the interpretation of Jabotinsky for the very messy reality of Israel.
I think it's fascinating to think about it in that way. And I'd like to ask you more about Begin as a Jew first and as an Israeli second. You talked about, Begin's charisma and relationship with the Mizrahim that kind of went above and beyond what any other political leader had been able to achieve at that time. But I think beyond the Mizrahim, there was something that he did for what it meant to be an Israeli. And I know this is something that you understand and you've studied perhaps better than anyone else, what it means to be an Israeli, certainly in the English language, and explaining that to a Jewish audience in the diaspora. So, how did the upheaval of Begin's election and perhaps just the trajectory of his leadership over the Israeli right, how did he change what it meant to be an Israeli? How did he bring Jewish identity in?
Yeah, it's a really crucial question, Tamara. I have to say that the formulation that you cited before, which is fairly common in characterizing Begin's own personal identity, Jewish first, Israeli second, I personally am not comfortable with that formula because I think Begin was so essentially Israeli in an essential Jewish way. For Begin, the two were inseparable, and yet at the same time, he realized that the Zionist revolution had actually created an identity called Israeli, in which not all Israelis were Jews. Not only Jews participate in Israeliness. Begin had the really extraordinary ability to, on the one hand, fully Judaize Israeliness, and at the same time create an opening for a shared civic identity with non-Jews that was Israeli. I'll give you an example. The the Arab Israeli community between 1949 and 1966 was governed by military rule. There were two parties that led the campaign to end military rule over Arab Israelis. Mapam, the far left Zionist party, the party of Hashomer HaTzair, and Cherut, Menachem Begin's party. That for me really is something essential, especially for this moment, because what Begin took for granted is that Zionism did two revolutionary moves. The first was to recreate the Jewish people. Zionism was not only the ideology of statehood, it was also the ideology of peoplehood. That peoplehood is the foundational unifying identity for Jews around the world, and the Jewish state was reconstituting the Jewish people, first of all, by physically bringing Jews from around the world into intimate proximity with each other, so that we would be refashioning a Jewish people that was greater than the sum of its parts through our mingling. That was the first revolution of Zionism, recreating the Jewish people. But Zionism also did something else, and not all Zionists were aware of this before the state. And unfortunately, not all Zionists are ready to own this second achievement today, and that is Zionism created a new people, a people called Israelis. And this people, which must coexist with Jewish Israel, with the reformulation of the Jewish people, the Israeli people is not only Jewish. Begin here, I think, was a very important model for us, precisely because he was the first Israeli prime minister who, on the one hand, was so unabashedly Jewishly rooted and also religiously rooted. Let's not forget that. He goes to the Kotel, he goes to the wall to give thanks to God the night of his election, the first Israeli prime minister to do that, puts on a kippah. And at the same time, he is affirming the place of Arab Israelis in Israeliness, in Israeli identity. That is the essential model that we so desperately need today, because that model is under assault from both sides. It's under assault from elements of the right, and tragically from elements within Begin's own party, who don't understand Begin and don't understand the ideology that they are supposed to be custodians of. And it's under assault from elements of the anti-Zionist left, especially in the diaspora, who want to separate the Jewishness, Israel's Jewishness and democratic identity. And that, for me, is, God forbid, the beginning of the unraveling of this very delicate fabric of Israeliness.
So everything that you described seems to me, from an outside perspective, could have made it unlikely for Begin to make peace, to be the first Israeli prime minister to make peace. But in fact, he was. And I'd love to hear from your perspective what you made of, Begin's success with Sadat, and, whether that serves as a model that could be replicated today with the Palestinians, whether it was unique in its time.
It's such an important question tomorrow, because we tend to take for granted that Menachem Begin withdrew from Sinai, yet radical departure for Begin from his own stated positions. Begin was elected on a slogan of Af Sha'al, not one inch from the Six-Day War, and that's certain to retire to one of the Sinai settlements. That was his public promise. And then to have the courage to realize that circumstances circumstances have changed. Israel had the opportunity to be siege against us. For the breakthrough that we experienced last year with the Abraham Accords. That astonishing moment when, for the first treaties that were based on mutual normalization, because whatever treaties we've signed until now were not based on real normalization. But what Begin understood was that you don't give up the chance of normalization, and that even signing a formal peace agreement and removing the largest and most powerful Arab country from the rejectionist bloc besieging Israel was an historic opportunity that required him to compromise on some of his most deeply held beliefs, public positions, and promises. That took extraordinary courage. And there's another interesting element here where I think Begin serves as a model for peace. I don't think it's a coincidence that the only leaders who really succeeded in making peace or in withdrawing, I mean, let's put that on the table, were right-wing leaders. And so what that tells me is that it's not only Nixon and China, the syndrome of you're able to neutralize your right-wing flank because you have right-wing credentials and you can make compromises that the left can't. It's deeper than that. What allowed Begin to make peace was his deep conviction that Israel was sacrificing. Israel was giving something up that we had earned. We weren't giving up occupied territory, we were giving up liberated territory. Now, whether Sinai was liberated or not, we can argue about. But the fact that Begin deeply believed that, I certainly believe that Judea and Samaria is liberated territory. And yet I believe, with all the pain involved, that if there is ever going to be a Palestinian Sadat, we are going to have to emulate Begin's painful, wrenching, historic compromise and reach that partition agreement, even over Judea and Samaria. That's where I part ways with the ideology that raised me. But Begin, in a way, parted ways as well. Now, it's true that Sinai is not Judea and Samaria. It's a very different move. Nevertheless, the model that Begin showed us is that if you're going to make peace, if you're going to withdraw from territory, it must be from that solid ground of affirming my right to this land. I am not an occupier, and I am certainly not an occupier in Judea and Samaria. That is mine. And if I have to give it up for peace, for compromise, not to rule another people, to preserve Israeli democracy, then I'm ready to make that wrenching change, that wrenching compromise, but only from that place that Begin showed us, which is kula shali, in principle, in the language of the Mishnah, it's all mine. But I'm ready to make that compromise for what I would call a higher value.
So I think what you just described showed that Menachem Begin was a man of nuance and was a man of compromise, but he's not seen that way by a lot of his critics. He's seen sort of as the opposite. There's almost kind of a strange dichotomy within him as this very rigid, ideological man who's, unwilling to change for political expediency. Yet at the same time, ultimately, when it came down to it, he was the one that was able to do that. So I'd like to delve a bit deeper there, either on the topic of, the Arabs and peace, or beyond that. How do you reconcile those two aspects of Begin's personality? Do you agree with my formulation of those aspects even?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the key to understanding Menachem Begin for me is paradox. Paradox in very moving and positive ways, and paradox for me in some less positive ways. So, for example, Begin, on the one hand, is the leader who brought the majority of Israeli Jews, the Mizrahim, into the Jewish mainstream. And he did that by empowering the Mizrahim politically, first of all, and also honoring the Mizrahim culturally, which is no less significant for transforming Israel into the country that we know today, where so much of Israeli music, for example, is Mizrahi. So much of our culture is Middle Eastern. And the wonderful irony is that Menachem Begin, who in some ways was our most Ashkenazi prime minister, I see someone in the chat here wrote he was the first Ashkenazi leader. And he was, in some way, he would kiss the hands of the ladies. He was a Polish gentleman. And yet, and always wearing a suit, of course, the most formal Israeli prime minister. And yet, Begin is the father of Mizrahi Israel, of this wonderful Easternness. We are now back in the East. You know, our hearts are longing for the East. It was Begin who brought us back to the East. And so he really helped solidify Jewish identity over the most divisive war in Israel's history. I made Aliyah in the summer of 1982, the very beginning of the First Lebanon War and the beginning of the unraveling of Begin's prime ministership. It was so agonizing for me to join Israeli society at precisely the moment when we were most tearing ourselves apart. This was the first war, and thank God, the only war, that not only failed to unite Israelis, but that the war itself was the pretext for tearing us apart. You had entire units, reservist units, finishing their tour of duty at the front in Beirut, returning their equipment, and going to Prime Minister Begin's home on Balfour Street to protest the war. We never had that before, and thank God we've never had it since. So here's Begin, the great unifier of Israeli society, the great divider. Begin, the peacemaker, the man who brought us our first and most significant peace treaty, the treaty that laid the foundation for all the other treaties to come, and God willing, for the treaties that are yet to come. Begin is the father of Middle East peace. And yet, the greatest obstacle, speaking from my perspective as a post-Beitari now, the greatest obstacle on our side to an eventual agreement, if we ever find a Palestinian partner ready to make a deal, big if we ever do, the great obstacle on our side will be, what do we do with the settlements? When Menachem Begin became prime minister in 1977, there were all of 5,000 Jews living in all of the territories post-67, including Sinai, including the Golan, including the Jordan Valley. There were a few settlements, scattered settlements in Judea and Samaria. Today, there are 100 times that, right? Today, there are 500,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria. I wish I could celebrate that. In principle, I do celebrate it. Practically, I'm torn apart by it. And so the legacy of Begin is multifaceted. It makes him, to my mind, our most interesting and complicated leader.
Thank you. I have one more question that I would like to pose, and then we will get to some audience questions. And I encourage you all to keep sending your questions in the chat. We have some great ones already, and I'd like to make sure that we get them in now so that we have time to ask all of them. So as a final question from me, something that I struggle with personally is that my own interpretation of Israeli history and the way Israelis perceive their own history is that Begin doesn't have a rightful place as one of Israel's founders. This could be for a variety of reasons. But I'm curious for your take on it, as someone who is an Israeli and who has a better understanding than I do. Do you think that Begin has claimed a place as a founder of Israel? If he hasn't, does he merit that title? Does he not? Where does he sit with regards to Israeli history?
I think that if you were to ask most Israelis to name the two most formative prime ministers, my guess is they would say Ben-Gurion and Begin, probably in that order. And I would put it in that order as well, although very closely tied. Those two are in their own category, and then comes everyone else, and you can grade all the other prime ministers after Ben-Gurion and Begin. They are the founders. They are the pillars of the state of Israel, and it's interesting to think of who won which argument. Begin, and here I'll speak more broadly, Begin and Jabotinsky, and I think Begin would certainly insist that when speaking of the legacy of his movement, it be framed within the context of Jabotinsky and Begin. Begin and Jabotinsky and Begin were vindicated in several crucial ways. First of all, the notion of what Jabotinsky called the Iron Wall. It was Begin who really, in a sense, implemented the Iron Wall. First of all, through the revolt against Britain, and the notion of Israel as accepting the siege that the Arab world has placed us in, accepting it as a given and waiting them out. Now, Mapai, the Zionist left, adopted the Iron Wall. And the greatest expression of the Iron Wall is Tzahal, is the IDF. And the vindication of the Iron Wall are the peace agreements and the collapse, the incremental collapse of the siege, the Arab siege against us. I also think that Begin and Jabotinsky were vindicated over the question of mass aliyah. This takes us back really into the 30s, the 20s and 30s of the last century, when the socialist Zionists were arguing for what they called selective immigration, of just really pioneers who would create the infrastructure, and Jabotinsky and Begin were demanding aliyah, now massive aliyah, rescue. Needless to say, history vindicated them. I believe that history has vindicated Ben-Gurion in two ways, at least. The first is on partition. The fact that even if partition fails, and it may fail with the Palestinians. Again, if we don't have a credible partner, it will fail. The fact that we were lucky enough to have a prime minister from the Labour Party in the year 2000 who said yes to partition, and Arafat said no, that bought us years of credibility, certainly with the Americans, certainly with world Jewry. I believe we're going to need to renew our commitment to partition in order to renew that, Hebrew we call it ashray. Can you help me out here tomorrow?
Sadly not. I wish I could. That's my fault.
The credit line. When we are perceived as a side that says yes to compromise, we earn a credit line. Not with everyone, certainly not with much of world opinion, but with our friends, with world Jewry, with the United States, with some of our friends in Europe. And that is crucial to our ability to fight the wars that we need to fight every few years. It is crucial for our ability to keep the Jewish people together. So partition, I believe Ben-Gurion was vindicated, and also in German reparations. And this is a very complicated issue for me personally. I grew up, of course, like many, I imagine many of the people listening here, boycotting German goods. For me, that was sacred. It was really the 11th commandment, maybe the 8th or 9th. You don't have anything to do in Germany. I believe that Ben Gurion was vindicated. I believe reparations helped save the state of Israel, stabilize our economy. And at the same time, I will always be grateful to Begin for raising that moral cry, that primal cry in 1950, 1951 of betrayal. How can you be renewing relations with Israel, with Germany? And so there, in a way, from a retrospective historical perspective, we needed a Ben Gurion to make that very painful pragmatic move, and we needed a Begin to protest and to cry out the pain of the Jewish.
That's beautifully said, and it's a great moment to move on to audience questions. And we received a few questions on the topic of Judea and Samaria that I would like to combine and ask you about. So the question goes, did I understand you correctly that you said that we know that Judea and Samaria are ours, but for the sake of peace, we're willing to give it up? Can you explain? And connected with this, Begin was against a Palestinian nation armed next to a Jewish nation. So why do you differ in your views? You being, why do you differ from Begin?
The first question, yes, you certainly understood. That is exactly what I meant. Again, I invoke the language of the Mishnah, which is kula shali, it's all mine. Shnai mochzim b'talit, two people are holding on to a garment. They both say it's all mine. You divide the garment. Wish there wasn't a competing people between the river and the sea. I wish we were there alone, just as they wish we weren't there. As we say in Hebrew, malasot, and we have to, I believe, come to terms with their presence. But we need to do it in a way that affirms our historical claim, so that we're not giving back Judea and Samaria, we're giving it up. That's my approach. In the same way that I understand Palestinians who also say kula shali, it's all mine, from the river to the sea. I have no problem with the Palestinians saying from the river to the sea is all theirs, because I believe from the river to the sea it's all mine as well. And so if two peoples believe that it's all theirs from the river to the sea, we have one of two choices. We're either going to continue fighting, one side will dominate the other, perhaps ultimately try to erase the other, or we're going to come to partition. I don't want partition. I desperately fear partition. I look at Gaza and I say, is that going to happen in Judea and Samaria? I live literally in the last row of houses in Jerusalem in a neighborhood called French Hill. I'm divided from Judea and Samaria by the security barrier. The next hill I look on, two Palestinian villages. Is that going to be Gaza? So I share all of the fears of the right. I share the fears of the right, and I share the right's insistence on our historical claim to the land. But I also agree with the left that permanently ruling over another people is in some ways even more dangerous, perhaps only slightly more dangerous, but I believe ultimately more dangerous to Israel's survival, certainly to our ability to remain a Jewish and democratic state. And I have not heard any convincing arguments, and I've listened to them. I used to believe them. I have not heard convincing arguments that can show me how we can remain a genuinely democratic and genuinely Jewish state and still rule over another people. Begin's idea of autonomy for the Palestinians, which is borrowed from Eastern Europe of the post-World War I era, which may be made sense for the Jews of Eastern Europe, it simply is, to my mind, a non-starter. The second question is, why do I disagree with Begin? So I think I hope I've made that clear.
Yes, thank you. I think so. So as a man of the people, what took Begin so long to get elected as prime minister? I thought this was an interesting question.
Very.
And yeah, go ahead.
Look, I think that Begin suffered from I would call it in some ways the Bibi syndrome. There are many Israelis today who can imagine Israel being safe without Netanyahu. It's inconceivable. And Begin suffered in reverse from that syndrome because many Israelis couldn't imagine how could Israel be safe, how could Israel be prosperous if you give up the reins of power from the party that presided over the founding of the states. Now, again, I think that was deeply unfair to Begin and the right because they were co-founders of the state. But in the perception of the first generations of Israelis, the founders was the Zionist left. It was Ben-Gurion announcing the state. Begin is not even a signatory on the Declaration of Independence. And I don't know the backstory there, but I imagine that politically Ben-Gurion froze him out, or unless he was still underground and couldn't actually physically sign. But whatever and there's really there must be an interesting story there. The perception was that the real founders were what was Mapai, was the labor Zionism. And so it took the country many years to get used to the notion that a change of government is actually normal in a democracy. And it's interesting. I appreciate the question because it really brings us to this moment. Is it really a national catastrophe that our longest serving prime minister is about to depart? Is this really the God forbid, an existential threat to the state of Israel? Many people consider the rise of Begin to be an existential threat. I remember hearing that from people I knew. Begin is going to come to power. He's going to plunge us into war. And lo and behold, the first peace agreement, 6 months after Begin comes to power, Sadat says, I can make peace with this guy. So let's learn to breathe. Let's learn to trust the solidity of the system, the integrity of the democratic process, and not fear change. That, I think, is part of the message of 1977 for Israel 2021.
So I'd like to get into we have a lot of questions about contemporary issues and contemporary politics that you sort of touched on. Is there a politician today in Israel that has a good appreciation or understanding of Begin in your opinion? A leading politician? Is there sort of I guess I would sort of to interpret the question, is there someone that is carrying that legacy forward?
Let me not answer the question directly and just let me tell you a story. I've been rereading one of my favorite books, White Nights by Menachem Begin. His lesser known book, I think it's his best book. I think it's one of the most important accounts of the Gulag that I know, not only Jewish account. It is in some ways the bookend to Sharansky's Fear No Evil. And it's a fantastic book, full of rich psychological insights, political insights. It's a brilliant book. Begin tells a story there of being interrogated by the KGB used to be the NKVD. And his interrogator they're engaged in all-night political, intellectual maneuvering. It's fascinating. And they recently, over the last years, found in the former Soviet archives the actual transcripts of these interrogations, which are included in the most recent edition, which I picked up at the Begin Center recently. And it's just stunning reading. And so there's one night, and this is an interrogation that's lasting through the night. It's the final night of interrogation. And the interrogator, exasperated, exhausted, frustrated by Begin's maneuverings, says to him finally, "Here's your statement, sign it." And the statement begins, "I, Menachem Begin, confess to being the head of the Beitar movement in Poland." Begin says, "I can't sign this." He says, "What do you mean? You admitted to being the head of Beitar." Begin says, "Yes, I admitted. I didn't confess." You can hear him. "I didn't confess. There's nothing to confess. You confess a crime. I readily admit being the head of Beitar." And it took all night for him to get this point across until finally the interrogator understood and changed the language. And there it is in the KGB, in the KGB archives. The language, "I, Menachem Begin, admit to being the head of Beitar." Why am I telling you this story in answer to your question? Is there a leader in Israel today who has that level of dignity, that level of sensitivity to language, to the integrity of your word, without making comparisons with any other politicians? One thing that everyone knew in dealing with Menachem Begin, his word was iron. Is there another politician in Israel today whose word is iron? So for me, it's not a question of finding the ideological heir to Begin, because Beginism is so much more than a set of ideological principles. It's a way of behaving. It's a way of leadership. It's a way of, first of all, placing the well-being of the Jewish people above your own well-being, being ready to sit in opposition permanently. And he had no idea that he would win the election in 77. Everyone knew if Begin loses this time, he's probably finished. He knew it. To be willing to lead in opposition with dignity, to be willing to place the well-being of the state even over his own promises. Because when Sadat came to Jerusalem, he realized the circumstances had changed. And Begin was willing. You listen to some of the Knesset debates over the withdrawal from Sinai. Begin was accused of treason from his own camp. There is nothing more painful than that, than to be accused of treason by your own people, of betraying where you come from. Begin did not betray where he came from. Begin fulfilled in the highest way where he came from. This was the man. Do we have a leader like that today?
So there have been a lot of questions and comments pushing back on your on what you were saying about the Palestinian claim on the land. And I want to play devil's advocate a bit and also give you the opportunity to explain further for the sake of the audience. What is the utility in acknowledging the Palestinian claim on the land when there is a lot of evidence, arguably, to refute that? I mean, what are you getting at here? What is the if I could ventriloquize some of what the audience is asking?
friends, lovers of Israel, we will not resolve this argument. I do want to say, I'm looking at one of the comments in the chat here. I find it interesting that Mr. Halevi self-describes as coming through the right politically. I'm actually not self-describing, actually did. I have a membership card from Beitar. I have the uniform. I did come through Beitar and seems to have currently ended up left. How did that happen? Now, one of the interesting things that's happened in Israeli politics in recent years, which I think much of the diaspora has not yet internalized, is that the debate in Israel today is no longer between the right and the left. There's very little left. Most of the left disintegrated after the Second Intifada. The debate is between the right and the center. The center, which is where I position myself, the center is that place on the political map that believes essentially two things about the Palestinians. One is, and about Judea and Samaria. One is that it is Judea and Samaria. It's not the West Bank for me, but it is the West Bank for Palestinians. And I have to come to terms with that because there is another people between the river and the sea. And I don't know that I will be able to come to terms with it. I don't know if it'll ever be safe for us to make peace with the Palestinians. But what defines the center as opposed to the right, and I'm speaking about the ideological right, there is a pragmatic right, but really the more ideological right, which says it's mine, nikuda, full stop, no matter what. I'm never going to withdraw from parts of Judea and Samaria. The center says, I understand that, it is ours. Under certain circumstances, I'm ready to make that painful concession. Now, yes, that's a left-wing position, but it's a right-wing affirmation. And maybe one of the main differences is that the language in the left says giving back the West Bank. The language of the center says giving up Judea and Samaria. It's a big difference. It's a major difference. And again, it depends on the circumstances. If there is a possibility, if a majority of Israelis come to believe, as we did when Sadat came to Israel, as initially a majority of Israelis believed over Oslo, it was a small majority, but it was a majority, then that will be a position that the center will lead. But we're not there yet. We're certainly nowhere near there.
Thank you. I think it's important to have these discussions and also, to hear an Israeli perspective, certainly on the way that Israeli society has shifted. So I'm glad that I asked you about that. So we have a lot of questions. Go ahead. Sorry.
Now, Tamara, I'm just looking at the chat, and again, I just want to say, there's no, I'm looking at the tone of the chats here. We've been through these. We all know the arguments. We've been arguing these points now. Certainly, those of us who came of age after 1967, we've been arguing this for 50 years. So let's try to take a deep breath and let's stop throwing slogans at each other. Let's stop throwing exclamation marks at each other. Let's see if we can if we can exchange exclamation marks for question marks. Are there other areas of doubt? And I say this to the left. You who are so ready, you say we should just sign an agreement with the Palestinians. Any doubt after the withdrawal from Gaza, after our experience of the last 15 years? Any second thoughts? And I say to friends on the right, any questions about what it'll mean for Israel to be permanently ruling 2 million, 3 million Palestinians? Do we give them citizenship as Ruby Rivlin wants to do? What will Knesset look like, even if we have a majority, even if we're 55% and they're 45%? What's that going to look like? If we don't give them citizenship, what's that going to look like? Any questions? So let's spare the exclamation marks, because we all know left, right, center, we all know the exclamation marks. Let's see if we can have a conversation about a conversation where some of the sentences end with a question mark.
I'd like to ask you, as we close the discussion, for a final thought on what we as Zionists and as lovers of Israel can take from Begin and, you know, Begin's life, Begin's impact on the Jewish people. What would you say to that?
First of all, the astonishing example of persistence. Persistence is very deep in the Beitar ideology. Beitar ideology was rooted on Hadar, which is the dignity of your personal behavior and your collective Jewish projection, how the Jewish people projects, and Tagar. Tagar is resistance, is fortitude, determination, the capacity to fight and overcome. And Begin embodies, better than any leader, since Jabotinsky certainly, these two qualities. And let me give you an example of Hadar. Hadar, and this is what we were raised on in Beitar. Hadar is Shlomo ben Yosef, the first Jew to be hung by the British, brushing his teeth morning he's taken out to be hung. That's Hadar. Hadar are the two Eliyahus, Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Betsuri, who assassinated Lord Moyne, members of the Lehi, assassinated the British colonial secretary for the Middle East, Lord Moyne, in Cairo in 1944. And they're about to be hung. The legend is that the hangman, the Egyptian hangman, weeps. And one of the Eliyahus says to him, "Don't weep, you're just fulfilling your responsibility." That's Hadar. That was Menachem Begin. Dignity. Hagar is to never give up. Menachem Begin is sitting in the NKVD headquarters in prison in Vilna. His interrogator says to him, "You will never see a Jewish state. It will never happen, and you personally will never get there. You belong to us. You are now our prisoner." And Begin is then sent north. He's sent into the Gulag. To read that and know the rest of the story is to in some way summarize Menachem Begin's life of Tagar. And Begin embodies the dignity of the Jewish people, the unbreakable determination of the Jewish people. And what a great good fortune we had as a nation, as a people, to merit his leadership.
That is beautifully said. What a great way to end such an insightful discussion. Thank you, Yossi. We're very grateful for your time today.
Sure.
And I hope the audience learned as much as I did from this. So now I'm excited to hand over, as we move on in the symposium, to Courtney and Jeffrey Blankenship, co-chairs of the Begin Symposium, and they will be introducing our next speaker.
Good afternoon and evening, everyone. My name is Courtney Blankenship, and I'm joined by my husband, Jeff. We are so proud to be the co-chairs of the virtual symposium this year and are proud of the accomplishments of the Hidden Light Institute and Menachem Begin Heritage Center.
Thank you to everyone. that is able to be with us today at this virtual symposium. Harry S. Truman said, "In periods where there is no leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when the courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better." I feel this quote not only embodies our next speaker, but also that of Menachem Begin. Michal Cotler Wunsh was a former member of the Knesset for the Blue and White Party. She served as chair of the Special Committee on the Drug and Alcohol Use, chair of the Subcommittee on Israeli Diaspora Relations, and is a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense, Law, Children's Rights, Women's Rights, and the Foreign Affairs Subcommittees and the Immigration and Integration Committees. Michal was also the chair of Canada-Israel Friendship Group, the Knesset's official representative on matters related to the International Criminal Court, and a founding member of the Inter-Parliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism. She also chaired the Knesset's caucus for Ethiopians in Israel.
Michal was born in Israel and grew up in Canada. She received her LLB from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and her LLM from the McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She is a PhD candidate in the Human Rights Under Pressure, Ethics, Law, and Politics program at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Free Universität of Berlin, researching freedom of speech, civil liberties, democratic theories, and multiculturalism. Prior to becoming a member of Knesset, Michal served as a research fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC Herzl and was a board member at Salve Pius, an NGO dedicated to creating opportunities to connect Israelis along the secular religious spectrum. She was also a dedicated legal advisor to the Golden family, working for the return of deceased Israeli soldiers Hadar Golden and Aron Shaul, as well as Israeli civilians Avera Mengistu and Hisham al-Said.
Thank you, Michal, for presenting today at our virtual symposium. And from people from Texas, that was a mouthful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff and Courtney, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you for everybody that is here with us. Thank you to the Menachem Begin Center for the opportunity to engage and follow up on a very humbling sort of opportunity to discuss some of the issues that Yossi had the opportunity to address. I'll share anecdotally that my own history that very likely brought me into Knesset, into this last Knesset, the outgoing Knesset, Israel's 23rd Knesset, is actually a little bit different than Yossi's, because I, as a 7-year-old little girl, sat on the night of what is known as the upheaval, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit later. I'll refer to the word. In Hebrew, it's mahapach. It has zero negative connotation, as opposed to upheaval, which for me, as opposed to the hopeful symbolism of the mahapach, actually upheaval sometimes or perhaps misses or gets lost in translation. But on that night, I sat in the Knesset cafeteria between giants of the generation. My mother was actually Begin's parliamentary secretary and legislative assistant. And I was a little girl who had sort of played hide and seek in the corridors of Knesset. She was at the time a single parent, raising me on her own in the 70s, not a simple task, nowhere, and certainly not in Israel at the time. And Menachem Begin was leader of the opposition, fierce leader of the opposition, understanding the opposition, no less than the coalition, is imperative for a functioning democracy, and taking that role as leader of opposition as seriously as he did when on that night, in the euphoric dancing that broke out in the cafeteria, and I'll share, I had no idea other than the fact that I was probably entertaining for all of the incredibly vested individuals who were really giants, figurative and real giants. Esther Aziel-Naor, Yechiel Kadishai, Ben-Zion Kishit. I mean, some of the people that Yossi grew up with in Beitar that to me were just uncles and aunts, and I was entertainment for the evening, and I got to eat as many pickles as I wanted. But you have to understand that as leader of the opposition, I had the tremendous honor, which I feel tonight emotionally, to speak about one of the most incredible individuals that has left a mark, not only on me personally, but as you heard from Yossi so eloquently, the legacy and inspiration of Menachem Begin, and what has left us with an incredible, myself for sure, an incredible sense of responsibility. So on that night, as a 7-year-old child, I sat in those, moments of euphoria, literally carried on the shoulders of those giants as dancing broke out in the Knesset cafeteria. And I'll add, and it's not less important, that my mom then married a very, very well-known international law activist and human rights champion or warrior even, Professor Michal Cotler. And so the intersection between the commitment of Menachem Begin to the Jewish people above and beyond all, not only to the entire Israeli public, but to the Jewish people worldwide, it is what he embodied, and to international law and human rights, it was not foreign to me. And I'll say, Menachem Begin's understanding of his own Jewish identity, his own Jewish leadership, did not have any contradiction in terms with the understanding of what human rights and the commitment to human rights we must champion, advance, promote, and protect. And so that in my own life became then moving to Canada. And yes, as Courtney said, I did grow up in Canada for the duration of my childhood after the age of 9 and until I graduated and came back to Israel actually to serve as a lone soldier and, pursued my first degree in law here in Israel, my second back in Canada, so the back and forth. And the reason that I think that's important, and I'm sharing it with you, is the understanding of the miracle that is the state of Israel. And I would say 73 years young that we return to, an indigenous people returning to an ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution. The understanding that Menachem Begin had, and I'll tell you that when I entered Knesset, and yes, I entered as part of the blue and white faction, but the picture that I had above my desk and that I saw every morning when I entered into Knesset, and that served for me as a humbling example of what it means to be a public servant to the entire Israeli public and the Jewish people worldwide. The picture that I had in my office and still have is Menachem Begin's. And alongside that was the Declaration of Independence. And the reason that I wanted to explore the Declaration of Independence a little more deeply and maybe engage in discussion and perhaps follow-up questions afterwards is I believe very, very importantly that the fact that Declaration of Independence was not anchored in law, was not given the sort of understanding or constitutional understanding for the Americans in the Zoom with us, for the Canadians, the Charter of Rights, the anchoring of the foundational values, principles of the Jewish and democratic state of Israel. It is all right there, in particular at this intersection of challenges. And when I say the intersection of challenges, I say this with a great degree of urgency. So the internal resiliency of Israeli society, Israel diaspora relations, and the challenges to Israel standing in the international arena. And if you read and engage with the text of the Declaration of Independence, which Menachem Begin embodied, it speaks and it actually creates the basis for solutions for all the challenges us at this intersection in terms of all of those issues that brought me into Knesset, that guides me in all of my work, whether it's academic, professional, voluntary, or parliamentary. And when I talk about the Declaration of Independence, actually, it's one of the first laws that I proposed, the Basic Law Declaration of Independence. I do very firmly believe that the fact that it was never anchored into law and given the status that it deserves is a great disservice to the imperative conversations we have not had as a young country at 73. And as the continued founding generation, whereas the founding mothers and fathers, Ben Gurion and Begin, that Yossi referred to, had the wherewithal to create the physical infrastructure for the miracle that is the state of Israel. I do believe that it is our generation's role to create what I would call the spiritual infrastructure for this incredible miracle that is the state of Israel, the return of an indigenous people to its ancestral homeland. And those foundational principles, if not anchored, leave us in quicksand. So where today we see that actually the war for the hearts and minds, and I talk about this as an international lawyer, the weaponization of international law and of human rights in this struggle for the identity of the state of Israel. Is it a democratic state of all of its people? Is it a Jewish and democratic state, as it was founded to be in the Declaration of Independence, anchored in those foundational values that speak to its being the nation state of the Jewish people, that uses the word equality over and over again, ensuring equality to all of its minorities, individuals of different faiths, backgrounds, and so on, and ensuring that we understand that here the state of Israel was actually founded as the nation state of the Jewish people, as a state among the nations, equal, a sovereign state, equal to all other countries. So the double standards, the delegitimization, the demonization of the state of Israel, the singling out of the state of Israel in implementing, in applying principles of international law and human rights, the responses to all of those challenges are all right there in that foundational document that has never been anchored in law, and that must be, in my view, anchored in that way. I'll share anecdotally just that I had the incredible privilege of not only knowing Menachem Begin as the leader of opposition, but of course, visiting the prime minister's home. And again, Yossi spoke about that very incredibly humane side of Menachem Begin. Of course, the gentleman who, was known for kissing the hand of every lady that he met. But as a little girl, I shared a picture that unfortunately I shared too late, that I would have shared with all of you. But as a little girl, remembering that I came to the prime minister's home when my mother was late for work because my piano teacher was right next door in the music conservatory, right next door to the prime minister's home. And when my mother was late to pick me up, the guard would let me into the prime minister's home. And I had the tremendous honor to play piano for Aliya Begin, the late Aliya Begin, whose legacy is so incredible. And of course, when the prime minister would come home with my mother, I continued playing piano for him as well, with milk and cookies. And at the time, of course, as a little girl, I didn't realize that I was in the midst of greatness. And what's most incredible about that greatness, in reflecting back, is the humility. And Yossi spoke about the dignity, and alongside that dignity, respecting the dignity of difference of all Israelis. And, I couldn't help but think of Barazani and Feinstein, next to whom Menachem Begin asked to be buried. And it wasn't just the first moment of understanding and loving Mizrahi Jews. It was the moment of understanding and loving all Jews, understanding that above all else, we are not just a country, we have a country. We are not just a religion, we have a religion. What we are is a people. And that commitment to our people was what guided Menachem Begin in his unequivocal commitment to unity. We just marked the shooting on the Altalena, which Menachem Begin risked his own life, understanding that we could not afford a civil war, the likes of which other countries, other democracies had seen, and that we would not be able to live through it. And literally, as Yossi said, being willing to sacrifice his own life in order to prevent civil war. It is part of my understanding of the reason that he is not a signatory to the Declaration of Independence. And I'm sure that that would be an incredible sort of delving into. I'll tell you and I'll share with you that when I was intended to submit my basic law Declaration of Independence, I received a beautiful gift of the Declaration of Independence. And it does have Begin's portrait there as well, because signatory or not, he signified, he embodied, he represented the intersection of those values that I've spoken about. The understanding that Jewish and democratic are actually in complete harmony and coexistence. And by the way, when they are in disharmony, we have to contend with that disharmony. We have to deal with it. We cannot afford to sweep it under the rug. It is in many ways, I believe, the responsibility of our generation to understand what sovereignty looks like. And sovereignty, I say very often, is not something, it's not a simple task. It's not something we should balk at. after thousands of years of lack of sovereignty. Sovereignty is something that we have to exercise, we have to understand, we have to implement, and we have to speak out. And my tools, my understanding, utilize international law. They speak the language of rights, the lingua franca, spoken around the world. But I would argue the lingua franca spoken not just by Begin, but by Jabotinsky. We know that the 5 memim, the 5 basic rights of every human being, those were Jabotinsky. Those are basic human rights. And when I speak of the right to pray or to worship of Jews, of Muslims or Christians, that's not just religious rights. Those are democratic rights. As opposed to, for example, and we just saw this in COVID-19, the right to protest. Those are not just democratic rights. They are, in fact, also our decree as, a Jewish faith that deeply believed in the imperative for a democracy, for the people to be able to speak out. And so, again, the opportunity to engage on this issue with you as part of this incredible conversation, I would say that at the end of the day, the overarching commitment to Israel's unity and what challenges us at the moment is that unity has become something of a compromise, not a goal. And somebody before asked Yossi, are there politicians that actually embody those values? And I would argue that the lack of clear vision that places unity as a goal is something that we are sorely, sorely lacking. And in many, many ways, we spoke about, and Yossi spoke about Begin as the peacemaker so quickly after he entered his role as prime minister. And what's very important when we equate, and Yossi did refer to the analogy of the Abraham Accords, I would argue that Begin was able to make that peace specifically with Sadat because of a basic understanding that we see happening again in the Abraham Accords. And that is a paradigm shift that enables the transition from rejectionism to normalization based on an inherent pivot away from what's known as the 3 no's of Khartoum: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, and no to peace with Israel, to the 3 yeses: yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, and yes to peace. And though it was so long ago, the personal relationship between Sadat coming to Knesset to recognize the state of Israel as what it was founded to be. And here I go back to the Declaration of Independence, not a democratic state of all people, not a Jewish halacha state. The foundational principles speak of the state of Israel being Jewish and democratic, and the recognition of the state of Israel as what it was founded to be, as Jewish and democratic, by coming to Knesset, by acknowledging that right to exist, the legitimacy to exist, what we see now as something that challenges us so deeply. That enabled the negotiation, which ultimately paved the path for peace. And in that sense, we're living at a historic time as far as, this last year has been, as difficult as it's been with COVID-19. The Abraham Accords actually inherently have that same potential paradigm shift underlying them, i.e. recognition, enabling negotiation, ultimately paving the path to peace. And I would very much hope, not just with the 4 countries that have signed the Abraham Accords, but far beyond that, with peoples of the region, with peoples we may have signed peace agreements with, but have what's known as a cold peace, whether it be Jordan or Egypt, certainly internally between Jews and Arabs inside the state of Israel, and absolutely to the potential resolution of conflict with the Palestinians, requiring that we understand the deep paradigm shift as opposed to what has actually been the historic paradigm, i.e. first make peace, then we'll negotiate the terms, and then perhaps we'll get to recognition. That first peace that Begin made with Sadat actually signaled the path for what I, at the very least, understand the Abraham Accords potential to be. I think it's imperative that we don't lose sight of that and don't just, and their name, by the way, attests to that, right? And speaks to that the values, the foundational values that we share in the Abrahamic faith enable, I would argue, moderates all over in all religions, including moderate Islam, to take back Islam from radicalized, forms of Islam. And that's true for all of us. It's true internally in the state of Israel. And Yossi spoke of the center. I would like to recoin that and talk about moderation, about the muscular moderates that must be recognized, identified, and empowered to lead the path forward. Because ultimately, when we see that the rhetoric, certainly at a digital age, where platforms actually, that's how the algorithm is wired, right? They not only enable a platform for radical or extreme voices, but they amplify the extremities. In fact, the good news is, the hopeful news is that the majority of Israelis, Jews and Arabs, ultra-Orthodox and secular, the majority of us, I would argue 80 or 85%, agree on 80 or 85% of the issues, 80 or 85% of the time. And it is the kind of leadership of Menachem Begin, a serving public servant that came to serve the entire Israeli public, that came to serve the entire Jewish people. And I would say not only came to serve everybody, but utilized the power of influence rather than the power of hierarchy. So it wasn't power that he was seeking. That was not the man that I was so lucky and humbled to know, but rather the understanding that influence expands your ability to grow a network, to reach more people. It doesn't take away, as opposed to power. When you give some of your power, you lose some of your power. It's the opposite with influence. And the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks spoke about the difference between optimism and hope. And when I think of the times that we're living in, and with that, maybe I'll end my sort of little piece and look forward to questions so that I can engage on issues that are, or topics that are more interesting to you. The differentiation that the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks drew between optimism and hope are the following. And he said, optimism is the belief that everything will be okay. And hope is the belief that we have to make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active one. And it takes no courage at all to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And the kind of leadership that Menachem Begin embodied was the leadership that gave people hope. At the end of the day, that is the role of a leader. It's the role of any leader in our home as parents, in our place of employment as bosses, to give people hope that they can achieve wherever it is and whatever it is that they want to achieve. And certainly in the case of the leadership of a country that has had this incredible opportunity, this miraculous opportunity to see the return of an indigenous people to that sovereign existence in the nation state of a people still in diaspora, and half of us here and half of us in diaspora, the imperative to renew the covenant and maybe even to reshape the relationship paradigm between Israel and diaspora. It centers very deeply on the Declaration of Independence in the way that it anchors the identity of the state of Israel as Jewish and democratic at a time where we see the shifting sands and the imperative to create a foundation that we all know we can rest on in order for us to begin that next level of infrastructure that we must build, that it is our role to build, our turn as the founding generation of this country. That spiritual infrastructure must have some shared foundations. And on those foundations, on the premise of the Declaration of Independence, I believe very deeply that Menachem Begin embodied so singularly, so uniquely, and when I think in a very, very humbled manner, to speak about what he might have thought or might have done or might have said, that is not my role. My role is only to be able to learn from the kind of leadership that he inspired, from the legacy and memory that he left, to understand that memory is about the past, but it is about the past so that we can identify and realize the current challenges in order to lead forward to the next 73 years in all of the challenges internally, in the internal resilience of the state of Israel, as I said, between Jews and Arabs, between ultra-Orthodox and secular, between young and old, between new immigrants and Sabras, of course, in the challenges that we see between Israel and diaspora and growing rifts. And actually, I didn't touch upon, but the last war made it very clear that what binds us together is so much greater than what sets us apart, and that we are a network and we are a people, and we must re-engage with that relationship paradigm and redefine it. And of course, in terms of Israel's challenges in the international arena, I didn't touch upon that, but in that very generous introduction, I was indeed the first appointed liaison to the issue of the ICC in Knesset. And it is imperative that we understand that there is an additional war to the military one that was waged on the state of Israel. It has weaponized international law and human rights. And in order to be able to combat or to even engage in that war, we have to engage utilizing the language of rights, the lingua franca, spoken by both our foes and our friends. That is the language spoken around the world, the language of security that the state of Israel very often utilizes, though it needs to also, of course, have security issues and understanding. That is not the language that makes our case heard in the international arena. And in order to rise from the docket of the accused, and in my introduction, again, you spoke of the golden case and cause, and I call it the golden case and cause because really it epitomizes the ability and the responsibility to not only affirm international law, which the state of Israel does, but to utilize its language to understand, apply, implement that language of rights in order to demand what every sovereign country must demand, i.e. the humanitarian needs of its own people. In this case, 2 deceased soldiers, Hadar Golden and Oron Shaul, 2 civilians, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed, both mentally unwell, who wandered into Gaza, all of whom have been held in Gaza in nearly a 7-year standing violation of international law. It all came to a head in this last war, making it very clear that the moment terror is enabled to dictate equations and reality on any issue and anywhere, it will, in fact, be not only enabled, but empowered with that culture of impunity to dictate reality and equations on all issues everywhere. And that is, I believe, what happened in this last war that we are in what's called a ceasefire. I remind us all that Hadar Golden was actually kidnapped and killed 1 hour after a ceasefire brokered by the UN and the US, supported by the EU, it came into force. And one more thing that I would perhaps make a point here with regards to Menachem Begin's memory and legacy, and that is the tremendous responsibility that elected leadership has to take to create vision. And I believe he was a visionary. He was a man of vision. And that's not to say that you can always implement and apply the vision, but there has to be the alternate vision presented to the public, and not just I would say a naysaying negative, what I am not, but rather a positive, what I am, what I do present as an alternate vision to the Israeli public. In my view, one of the most politically savvy, incredible publics that I am familiar with, of course, this one perhaps more than others, in a reality that is not simple. And maybe I'll end here with that message of tremendous gratitude to all of you for being here, and hope that we continue to engage on these issues with a legacy, with a memory of Menachem Begin leading us forward in terms of the leadership that we aspire to. And I'd love to hear any of the questions you might have.
Michal, thank you so much for that wonderful address. You've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the pairing, if you like, of the Declaration of Independence with Begin, because the Declaration of Independence has, as you said, it has that that sort of seminal dual pairing of the rights of the indigenous rights of the Jewish people and the equal rights of the citizens, and Begin embodied that like no other Israeli prime minister, really. And also, I think you stated things which I think Begin took as a given, and which you take as a given, of the fact that Israel is the state, the nation state of the Jewish people, and is a democratic nation state of its citizens. And maybe I'll start with a question that it seems that today, and perhaps this is just a sort of symptom of the polarization, that it often sounds like people are, obviously outside Israel, the critics of Israel reject that and say, oh, it can't be a democracy, all this stuff, misunderstanding a whole bunch of things about Zionism and what it means. But also within Israel, you see or you hear from different quarters sides that seem to lean more towards the Jewish side and reject the democracy aspect, or lean more towards the democracy universalist side and reject the Jewish nation, Jewish nationhood aspect. Is that something? Do you see that as a sort of sign of the times? Is there a way out of that?
So I thank you for that question, Paul. First of all, I see it as one of the greatest challenges of our times. I see it as a challenge not only internally, but in terms of Israel-diaspora relations and Israel's standing in the international arena. And I actually see the solution to it deeply in the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. And Canada, and again, I grew up in Canada, only adopted the Charter of Rights in 1982. And when we sort of envisioned, and I was a young lawyer then working at the Supreme Court, what we call now the constitutional revolution, and the whole understanding of the inherent tension between the powers in democracy, of course, the legislative branch, the judicial, and the executive. When we address that, it is very important to understand that unless you have a basis from which to begin, and we saw it play out with a nation state law, right? Does it have equality in it? Doesn't it have equality in it? Well, the Declaration of Independence would have prevented the entire showdown. And in so many ways, it is fundamental to understanding what we need to do in order to move forward. And yes, I do see a very clear war on Israel's identity. It is below the radar and above the radar. It is above board and below board. It is in Knesset and outside of Knesset. It is in Israel and outside of Israel. And the question at the end of the day should be as follows. And I ask this very consistently of my Democratic friends world over, academics and so on. Is it legitimate in any other country to re-envision or to redefine vision, mission, values of any other country, when clearly this is the vision, mission, values upon which the state of Israel was founded? There is no other country in the world whose very legitimacy to exist as what it was founded to be, Jewish and democratic. What it was founded to be are the intersection and the coexistence, harmonious or disharmonious, between those very important foundational principles. There is no other country in the world that is questioned for its very legitimacy, except for the Jew among the nations. Now, we have to engage with that. We have to engage our peers. We have to engage everybody in their capacity, right? Fellow parliamentarians, fellow governments, academicians, but we have to engage in it authentically. And the only way to do so is to do it equally and consistently. You can't, use or enable or gloss over double standards applies to the state of Israel, not by international law, not by institutions mandated to uphold, promote, and protect international law. Of course, I speak of UNRWA, I speak of the UN, I speak of the World Health Organization, I speak of the United Nations Security Council, I speak of the United Nations Human Rights Council. We have to be able to address, first of all, to identify, then to expose, and then to address those double standards. Because essentially when you enable a singling out of one state, it happens to be the Jewish state among the nations. And the Declaration of Independence, I read it in preparation for this, and it starts saying, this recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their independent state may not be revoked. It is, moreover, the self-evident right of the Jewish people to be a nation, as all other nations, in its own sovereign state. That is the opening line of the Declaration of Independence. And when you think about the importance of every single word there that we may take for granted, as you said, and perhaps Menachem Begin was able to take for granted at the time or thought it would never be questioned. But we know today, we know what these last 2 weeks have shown us. We don't need to look far. We also know what the Durban Conference of 2001, which was, I don't know, the opening shot, maybe it was Zionism as Racism, 1975. Certainly Durban in 2001, the Conference Against Racism, ironically, the largest hate fest we've ever seen against the state of Israel, was the opening shot in the implementation of a systematic strategy to delegitimize the state of Israel by weaponizing international law and human rights. Now, that hasn't just harmed the state of Israel. Don't get me wrong. When we allow the state of Israel to be called a genocidal apartheid state, we actually undermine not only the responsibility of the family of nations to maintain the rule of law and the rules-based order, but what genocide actually was is minimized. What apartheid actually was, and I remember very clearly as a young child whose father represented Nelson Mandela around the world, what apartheid actually was. And that is the role that we have in terms of bringing hope to all peoples held hostage by their own regimes. It doesn't matter to me if it's in Iran or the Uyghurs in China or in Venezuela, because at the end of the day, there is a role for the state of Israel as Jewish and democratic to play. A very important, significant international role. Again, we're talking about Menachem Begin, his legacy and his memory. He deeply understood that role that we have to play, not as a chosen people that are above others, the opposite, chosen for a greater responsibility as the proverbial canary in the mine shaft with what we have seen and what we have experienced, not because we're special, probably because anti-Semitism is the oldest form of hate that we've seen mutate through so many generations. We see it mutating again now. And, very often, and in my introduction, we formed an interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism. Well, what you see today is that anti-Semitism is but a predictive example of what challenges democracy and threatens the foundations of democracy, including what we saw on Capitol Hill on January 6th, and that is disinformation and misinformation. And so the role we have to play is tremendous. And again, I go back to the Declaration of Independence as an anchoring document, which Menachem Begin inherently, deeply, personally, collectively, nationally, in every way I can imagine, embodied in every bone of his body. And when I go back, for his yortzites, and each time I'm moved to tears to, remember once again that he asked to be buried next to Feinstein and Barazani, Iraqi, Polish brothers. At the end of the day, when we remember that speech, when we imagine what he knew then and the foresight that he had to understand that without understanding the deep commitment to the Jewish people, yes, as the nation state of the Jewish people, but to the Jewish people around the world, whether they were here or not, we cannot actually fulfill our role as a sovereign state.
Thank you so much. So there's a couple of questions which take us to sort of contemporary issues somewhat. I've got one which is one of those what would Begin think type thing. So you can sort of answer it as you wish. But it's asking about what you think Begin's opinion would be about the Ram party, the Arab party of Mansour Abbas, joining the government, which looks like it may happen, and it would be the first time a specifically Arab party is in a coalition, in a governing coalition.
So first of all, I would never dare speak on behalf of Menachem Begin. I'll of course share my thoughts on that, based on a deep respect for what Menachem Begin represented. And at the end of the day, I'll share, perhaps I'll begin with the anecdote. The anecdote is that as chair of the Drugs and Alcohol Committee, my members of my committee, with whom I regularly visited recovering addict centers, communities of recovering addicts from drug and alcohol use or substance abuse of any kind, were Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram party you just referred to. And I should ask Yossi Tayyib from Shas and Eliyahu Baruchi from Aguda. I was like the beginning of a joke. Every Sunday morning, a woman, a Haredi, a Shasnik, and an Arab walk into not a bar, a recovering alcoholic center. And and at the end of the day, what was very important, and the reason I begin with that anecdote is there was an incredible understanding that we are at an intersection in terms of Israel's life at 73 years young, where we need to transcend what presumably or actually divides us, and focus on what unites us. And what united us very clearly on those tours is that we are all dealing with issues, very deep civilian issues, which Mansour Abbas has chosen to, shine the spotlight on, including, of course, there was no differentiation between ultra-Orthodox, Arab, religious, secular, women, men of all ages dealing with substance abuse and the way that the state of Israel must deal with addictions. And I'll tell you, 1 in 10 Israelis is addicted to something. It is a serious issue. And we are not up to speed with what addiction should be defined as, and so on and so on. But in addition to that, there was another understanding that came out of those tours. And I'll tell you that I held a joint session between Mansour Abbas's committee to combat violence in the Arab sector and my committee, because guess what? Violence in the Arab sector, because violence everywhere is inextricably linked to substance abuse in all sectors. And what that actually enables is the way, or paves the path forward to transcend, again, what divides us and focus on what unites us and what challenges and ails us all. But there is a very important glossing over that we shouldn't, I would say that we shouldn't avoid discussing and raising. And that is what the Declaration of Independence harbors so naturally, the acceptance of the legitimacy of the state of Israel to exist as what it was founded to be, i.e. Jewish and democratic, not democratic state of all people, not Jewish halacha state. And as I said before, you can't just change vision, mission, values without telling anybody. That is not what it was founded to be. And that is a discussion that's very important to engage with and in, including with Mansour Abbas. I would say including with ultra-Orthodox parties, including with national religious parties, including with secular religious parties, Jews, Arabs, ultra-Orthodox, secular, all of us, as we envision the next 73 years of this miracle that is the state of Israel. It's not something we can afford to sweep under the rug. And COVID-19 was a tremendous opportunity. And I'm very sad that we are in this political, deadlock, because COVID-19 actually, and I'm sure this is true for all countries, we're not special. It actually didn't invent anything. It just exposed and highlighted the tremendous challenges and opportunities alongside them if we recognize them, identify them, and realize those opportunities together. It is, in fact, why I joined a unity government after 3 elections. It is where my source of disappointment was, because unity, as I said, for me, is a goal. It is not a compromise. And until we actually conceptualize that with its manifestations, i.e., in many ways, there's no more need for these sectorial parties. The sectorial parties actually are not a representation or a mirror of what's happened in the Israeli public. How do I know? Because as somebody intimately involved with what's called the third sector, right? The non-for-profit organizations, they service everybody. Everywhere that there's a vacuum, it doesn't matter if it's Shalva with children with disabilities or Leket with people that are lacking for food. They service everybody equally. They transcend perceived or real differences. That is where we're at as a maturing state. It's where we need to be, and we are in a process. It's imperfect. It's blemished. It's not pretty. And I do believe that the Knesset is the important place to affect policy change. I did excuse myself from this last election for multiple reasons, a little bit because of what we see right now. But the Knesset is an imperative place, not only as one of the branches or the legislative branch of a democracy, but also as the supervising branch of the executive, which I'll say about Menachem Begin, as leader of the opposition for 29 years, I believe. He was an exceptional leader of an opposition. He understood that for democracy to function, it's not enough that there's a coalition. The opposition is no less important. In what's known as a shadow government, it's imperative to supervise the executive branch. And legislation is but one parliamentary vehicle. It is certainly not, and I say this as a lawyer, the solution for all of what ails us. And very often it's that inability to supervise the executive branch that renders the Knesset much weaker than it should be.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, which is it's also a sort of current question, a current issue. And before I ask it, if you'll allow me, I'll just say a very short Begin anecdote, which I think is very relevant, which is that when Begin went to the United States, as prime minister, he met with Rabbi Alexander Schindler, who was the head of both the head of the Conference of Presidents of American Jews and also head of the Reform movement. And Schindler wrote afterwards, or said afterwards, that he had been expecting to really dislike Begin because he'd been told by all his left-wing friends that Begin was the right winger and the right wingers were the bad guys and all this kind of stuff. And when he met Begin, he actually found the first Israeli prime minister who really cared about diaspora Jews and who really spoke to him as a Jew, not just as an Israeli or even as a Jew first. So with that in mind, or maybe with just as a preamble, the question is, it's a question about Jewish unity, and the questioner asks how we go about establishing or assisting that unity when there is this issue of non-Orthodox Jews, Reform and Conservative Jews, feeling like they have second-class status, or at least their denominations have second-class status in the state of Israel.
So it's a very important question. And the most important thing, actually, and I did this over and over as the chair of the Israel Diaspora Subcommittee, the most important thing that we cannot stop is engaging. We have to engage. And when I say engage, I mean very clearly, and I want to be very explicit about this, not speaking to diaspora about what we need, about what challenges us, speaking to each other as equals at eye level. When I talk about recognition, enabling negotiation, paving the path to peace, I mean that internally amongst ourselves, because recognition, mutual recognition, is the foundation for the ability to discuss and actually reshape the relationship paradigm. There is a lot that we need to discuss. But I would add on top of that, the imperative to beyond engagement, to be very clear on the responsibility of the State of Israel. The State of Israel today, I believe, has much greater responsibility than ever, not only to realize what it means conceptually to be the nation state of the Jewish people. First of all, numerically, the majority of us are here. Second of all, it is diaspora Jewry that needs to re-engage with us as much as we need to re-engage with them. Of course, that includes the multi-denominational piece. Of course, it includes the conversion issues. And, one of my last, speeches in Knesset, in the plenum, was after there was a decision rendered by the Supreme Court that was attacked vehemently in Knesset, and actually it was an unplanned speech. I never did this. I always had notes because I'm that kind of a student. I always had notes and prepared words to say in plenum. And on that day, I actually asked to speak, although I wasn't scheduled to speak, to say the following. This is not about judicial activism, what's known as the State of Israel, when the court is attacked for becoming involved in something that it doesn't have a right to be involved in. It's overly activist. The opposite. It was passivism. It was judicial passivism, because this had been a 15-year process regarding non-Orthodox conversions. And after 2 full committees were appointed and their recommendations submitted to various governments, including this current one, the last one by Moshe Nissim, and none of them were implemented. And that's why when I talk about the imperative for a young country to understand that sovereignty includes good governance, what we see right now is bad governance. It's not enough that we have committees and reviews and recommendations. We have to implement them. And that's the role of Knesset, to supervise the executive branch. And so then to, speak to the court's involvement when no one else took responsibility and the court was, appealed to in order to take responsibility for private cases, that is complete lack of taking responsibility. And at the end of the day, yes, we have to engage. Yes, we have to discuss. Yes, we have to acknowledge that the state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people that has the right to exist as what it was founded to be, back to the Declaration of Independence, Jewish and democratic. And with that come concerns that we have to address in terms of other conversions, perhaps. But the founding principles of this Declaration of Independence that I'm holding in my hand, as the nation state of the Jewish people, to which an indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, the founding principles demand that we engage and demand that we take responsibility, because that's what sovereignty means, though we don't have necessarily good practice. It demands that we create or ensure viewpoint diversity around decision-making tables, because very often it is people who have known only this way of doing business. So I'll say, You know, looking at Israel from the inside out is very different than looking at Israel from the outside in. It is what Begin, in that story you told, that beautiful anecdote, it is what Begin embodied once again, beyond the fact that he was a mensch and his humility and his charm exuded. Beyond all that, he understood the existence of the state of Israel from a different perspective than only the inside out. And that is the perspective from the outside in. And that is the legacy. That is what has to guide us forward. That is the important engagement that you do with the Begin Center, with creating this legacy with very practical tools in this current, very challenging intersection of what we see in terms of Israel's internal resiliency, Israel-diaspora relations, and Israel's standing in the international arena.
Thank you so much, Michal Cotler Wunsh. That was a brilliant address and answering the questions and really helping us appreciate Begin all over again and in a different way. And I think demonstrating the extent to which Begin has inspired another generation of inspiring leaders. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that we hope very much to see you back in public life very, very soon. Okay. Now we're going to move on to a very special part of the symposium. It's the presentation of the Begin Award for Israeli Leadership. To make the presentation, I will hand over to the President and CEO of the Begin Center, Mr. Herzl Makov.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends here in Israel and around the world, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this part of the Begin Symposium. When we decided to establish this new initiative of an annual symposium inspired by the legacy of Menachem Begin, we wanted to include a special award associated with it. There were many aspects of Menachem Begin's legacy that we could have chosen as a basis for this award. We decided to focus on leadership. Begin was a once-in-a-generation leader, guided by unshakable values, but also understanding that those values cannot exist only as grand ideas or theories. They must be implemented in ways that actually help people. For him, the individual, the human being, the fellow Jew, is the center of the world, the focus of public service. He was a leader who led not by the example of power, but by the power of his example. Israel and the Jewish people were most fortunate to have had such a leader. He was unique. But though there will never be another Menachem Begin, Israel does not lack leaders and people of character and achievement who have committed themselves to public service and the needs of society. With this in mind, it is my great pleasure to present the inaugural Begin Award for Israeli Leadership, Begin למנהיגות ישראלית, to Israel Minister of Aliya and Integration, Pnina Tamano-Shata. Minister Tamano-Shata made history as the first Israeli minister of Ethiopian origin, and before that, as the first woman of Ethiopian origin elected to the Knesset. These firsts are significant, making her an important role model in a community that has experienced many challenges and difficulties. But even before she entered politics, Minister Tamano-Shata had been a leader. As a young activist, she was involved in many community organizations dealing with youth at risk and the socially disadvantaged, as well as fighting for women's empowerment and against racism. She was a member of the National Economic Council, serving as a chairwoman of Subcommittee on Higher Education, and was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Agency. She also led Israeli advocacy efforts around the world and in Jewish community in the United States in particular. And she still had time to qualify as a lawyer and to work as a journalist on radio and television, becoming the first Ethiopian female anchor on Israeli television. Learning more about her personal history, I realized that leadership is in her blood. She is a descendant of a distinguished line of Jewish community leaders in Ethiopia and the granddaughter of Case Shato Maharat, an important spiritual leader of the Jewish community in Ethiopia. Minister Tamano-Shata's political career is still in its early stage, but she has already made her mark as a member of a Knesset, working to promote the cause that have always motivated her: social justice, equality, and anti-racism. Following protest by Ethiopian Israelis in 2015, she led the establishment of the Palmore Committee, resulting in the Palmore Report to combat racism here. She also led the new policy of integrating Ethiopian into Israeli society, a comprehensive new way, which includes assisting their integration into childhood education all the way through to their army service and then higher education and employment. As Minister of Aliya and Integration, she led Operation Rock of Israel, bringing 2,000 Ethiopians to Israel whose Aliyah process had been on hold, as well as hundreds of members of the Bnei Menashe community in northern India. She had also focused much needed attention on the rescue of Jews living in hostile countries whose lives were in danger. I know that the minister has a great regard for Menachem Begin. She spoke movingly of her appreciation for being in the new documentary film Upheaval about Begin's life. It was Begin who started the ball rolling, which ultimately led to Operation Moses in 1984. One of the greatest acts of kibbutz galuyot, integrating in gathering of the exile in Israel history. And one that I know is of particular importance to Minister Tamano-Shata, it was Operation Moses, which brought her at the age of 3 to Israel with her family. Begin had already retired from public life when this took place, but I know that he saw it as one of the great acts of justice and Jewish responsibility by the state of Israel to bring, as he said, our Ethiopian brothers and sisters home. I heard from his military secretary, military advisor, that after Begin retired, the only issue that he was interested in and asked to be updated was the issue of the Ethiopian Jews situation. We should also remember that when Begin came to power, his domestic priority was improving the lives of Israeli citizens living in poor conditions and suffering discrimination. And so, there is something fitting that on the first occasion of presenting this new award, the Begin Award for Israeli Leadership, Magen Begin Lemanigut Israelit, I am presenting it to someone who has devoted so much of her time and energy, not only to the cause of Ethiopian Israelis, but to the cause of social justice more broadly. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Pnina Tamano-Shata.
עליתי לארץ בגיל 3, בשנת 1984. חלום ציון, חלום ירושלים. אין ספק שמי שחווה עלייה בחייו, גם אם זה בגיל מאוד מאוד צעיר, זה דבר שנשאר ומעצב את הזהות לאורך כל החיים. אני עוסקת בחיזוק עולים, עוסקת בחיזוק מי שחווים קשיים של השתלבות, לא בגלל שהם צריכים להשתלב, אני תמיד אומרת, זה עניין של שיתוף פעולה, וצריך לדעת שהרבה פעמים האנשים שנראים לנו שהם מחוץ לשוליים, זה לא הם בהכרח. הקונצנזוס צריך להיות הרבה יותר פתוח לכולם, וצריך להכיל את הגיוון, כי המגוון הישראלי הוא הכוח. ולכן, כשאנחנו רואים עולים חדשים, אני חושבת שזה עוצמה וכוח לדעת, לתת להם את המקום לביטוי התרבותי, לתת להם מקום לביטוי שלהם מארץ מוצאם.
אחים ואחיות יקרים, עולה מבצע צור ישראל, מדברת שרת העלייה והקליטה, פנינה תמנו-שטה. אני נרגשת להודיע לכם על כניסה לשטח האווירי של ישראל בירוסלם.
And now, I am delighted to welcome to the stage the recipient of the Begin Award for Israeli Leadership, Begin למנהיגות ישראלית for 2021, Minister of Aliya and Integration, Pnina Tamano-Shata.
Honorary President Reuven Rivlin, Herzl Makov, President and CEO of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, Menachem Hoenlein, Yossi Klein Halevi, Michal Cotler Wunsh, Harav Meir Soloveichik, our dear Jewish communities. Bring me, my brothers, the Ethiopian Jews, said the Prime Minister Menachem Begin to the head of the Mossad Yitzhak Chofi in 1977. This was the first time that Prime Minister of the young country Israel referred to Beta Israel, my community, Jewish from Ethiopia. I was not yet born at that time. After decades that my community fought for the recognition as the Jewish people, Begin paved the way to the realization of our 1,000-year-old dream to come back home, to Eretz Israel. This set the decision-makers' practical foundation for the Operation Moses, the journey that I made. I was only 3 years old when my family fled our village in Ethiopia, together with thousands crossing the desert through Sudan with our eyes direct to Zion, to Jerusalem. For me to stand here in this moment and receive the Begin Award for Israeli leadership as a granddaughter and descendants of the spiritual leader of Beta Israel, the Kesim, it is a huge honor. Menachem Begin was the first prime minister that, in his world, saw us as brothers, as sisters, that must be part of the 12 tribes that returned to Israel. But it is not surprising I admired Begin for the ability he had to see all of the different communities of Am Israel as one. As he said 40 years ago, Ashkenazi, Iraqi, Jewish, brothers, fighters. This was Begin's words then, and these words stay with us today. He knew that the Israeli government's most important mission is not only to build a country, but also to build a strong, cohesive, and united society. Begin also emphasized that Aliyah must not be selective, that we must look in the eye of every Jewish community and care for those in need. This is a vision that I carry with me as a Minister of Aliyah and Integration, as the first minister from the Ethiopian community. And this is a Jewish value that we must all carry with us every day, to act to connect the different parts of Israel's society. As such, at a young age, I started my activities as a law student struggles to promote equality. In the last 2 decades, I also had the privilege to get acquainted with the Jewish communities all over the world, tell the unique story of the Beta Israel community. And later, I paved my way to become a lawyer and journalist. Almost a decade ago, when I was 31, I decided that it is my time to be part of the decision makers in Israel, to bring change, to lead the national mission of the optimal integration of my community and for the disadvantaged groups in the Israeli society. Among other struggles, I led to the change in the blood donor policy, and today Israeli Ethiopians can donate blood as equal. I stopped all the separated programs that become a barrier for integration in the education system, in the IDF, and in other public bodies. I led Operation Tzur Israel in the last year to bring 2,000 Olim from Ethiopia and reunite children with their parents here in Israel. I renewed the Aliyah from North India, members of the Bnei Menashe, our sister and our brother, that waited for so long to be here with us. I led most of the struggle against racism and discrimination only because I believe in the Israeli society. I believe that only when we create a space of belonging and equal opportunity for all, only then we will be a model society. This day, I'm closing exactly a year in my position as a minister. I entered to the government during a challenging time when the world and also Israel dealt with COVID. And in my position, my biggest challenge was to make sure that Israel stay open for Aliyah all the time. Aliyah never stopped since Israel's establishment, not in time of crisis, not in time of routine. For the days when Menachem Begin was in charge of Beitar in Poland, before Israel's independence, training tens and thousands of youth for mission of defense and Aliyah, when it was still illegal, and to this day, Aliyah has always been a central pillar of the state of Israel. And I am happy to tell you that more than 25,000 Olim Chadashim arrived in the last year since the pandemic. Along with deep commitment, the government put a high emphasis on the relationship with the Jewish in diaspora. Unfortunately, these days, we know that the Jewish diaspora is experiencing high level of antisemitism, anti-Israel, The new version of anti-Semitism has exploded because of the recent operation, Guardian of the Wall, that was forced upon us by the terrorist organization Hamas that attacked Jerusalem on Yom Yerushalayim. We saw anti-Semitism raise its head while Israel fought for its right to protect itself. But as always, throughout history, Israel and the entire Jewish nation are measured in the difficult times. And I can promise you that our nation resilient is strong. As a nation that knew difficult times, but also moments of pride, Israel is like a miracle. We will continue to proudly raise our flag. We will continue to strengthen the nation resilient. We are measured by our ability to be together. We will continue to stand strong together against those who wish evil upon us. This also means that we must always have the courage to make social amendments, fix injustice, and ensure that all parts of Israel's society have a place. I want to share with you a short personal story. When I was 16 and our electricity at home was cut off because of late payment, I looked at my today 80 and 90 years old parents who were sitting with candles at the night and smiling. As a first-year teenager, I thought to myself that they were nuts. And I asked them why they are smiling. They said to me, Pnina, the most important thing is that we are together in Eretz Israel. This is the light. Imagine what is for my parents today to see me as a minister. For them, it is a realization of Shivat Zion, a vision that we pass on from one generation to another. I'm sure that if former Prime Minister Menachem Begin was alive today, he would be happy to see that his call, bring the Ethiopian Jews, materialized. I stand here as a proud member of the Israeli government, and it is my honor to carry Menachem Begin heritage and spearhead his message of unity. I want to thank the prize committee for the 2021 Begin Award for Israel Leadership from the Begin Heritage Center. And I will continue doing everything in my power and in my position to serve Israel public, the Olim Chadashim, and to promote and support the Jewish in diaspora. Thank you very much.
Hello to our audience members from around the globe. My name is Bernard Haston, and I'm proud to be the chairman of Or HaTzafun, otherwise known as the Hidden Light Institute. We are so proud to see the turnout today. We appreciate all our presenters and topics that have been presented thus far. I would like to thank our speakers, the staff of the Hidden Light Institute, and the Menachem Begin Heritage Center for all the hard work put into both our virtual event and webinar series that started in December of 2020. More than ever, with the real and rising threat of anti-Semitism and total Jew hatred in the United States and around the world, there has never been a more relevant time to share the legacy of a man like Menachem Begin, who never compromised when the dignity of the Jewish people was at stake. I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker for our virtual event, Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik. Rabbi Soloveichik is director of the Zahava and Moshel Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University and the rabbi of Congregation She'erit Israel, the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States. He has lectured throughout the United States, Europe, and in Israel to both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences on topics relating to Jewish theology, bioethics, wartime ethics, and Jewish-Christian relations. In planning for the future, please make note our first in-person event will be in Jerusalem at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. It will be held in March of 2022, and we will provide details once the exact date is secured. We hope you can join us just outside the Old City at their amazing venue early next year. At this time, I would like to welcome our concluding speaker, Rabbi Soloveichik, who will be discussing moral leadership. Today, more than ever, this topic is incredibly important. Thank you, Rabbi Soloveichik, for your participation today.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for your gracious words and for all that your family has done to perpetuate the memory and the legacy of Menachem Begin. On the Mount of Olives overlooking the Temple Mount sits the grave of Menachem Begin. Begin had chosen not to be buried with Israel's statesmen on Mount Herzl, but rather among his brethren, who over the centuries had asked to be interred overlooking Jerusalem's Temple Mount, Judaism's most sacred site. Begin, by request, lies next to Meir Feinstein and Moshe Barzani, two fighters, young men, who had died in each other's arms in British prison. Begin, at his place of burial, is thus forever bound with the warriors of the underground, many of whom he had led, and also forever linked by his burial site to Jerusalem, a city whose name is rooted in the word shalom, or peace. This is apt, for Begin was, on the one hand, one of modern Israel's greatest fighters and visionary revolutionaries, but he was also Israel's most famous peacemaker. Begin's burial place next to Jewish warriors overlooking a city named for peace forever captures the complexity of his life story and the essence of his moral vision. In my talk, I will argue that Jerusalem itself embodies Begin's worldview and that the significance of where he asked to be buried after he died tells us so much about the moral vision of this man when he lived. We begin with a question. What museum contained in its collection the most valuable objects in the history of the world? If you, ladies and gentlemen, could visit any exhibit in any edifice throughout the ages, what would it be? To me, the answer is obvious. And it is not the Louvre or the Hermitage or any palace of yesteryear. No, ladies and gentlemen, the answer is and must be an edifice that was designed in and erected in 71 CE, immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem. It was built by the Emperor Vespasian in order to exhibit the manifold treasures taken from his one major conquest, the temple in Jerusalem of the Jews. The building and the golden objects within it made this museum one of the wonders of Rome, and the name that Vespasian bestowed upon the edifice was the Temple of Peace. For several centuries following, if you wish to see the menorah or the shulchan, the table of the temple, or other objects, you can make your way to the Roman Forum and visit the Temple of Peace. In rabbinic literature, there are sages who would say, in words redolent with pain, I was in Rome, and there I was able to see the menorah. When they tell us this, they do not say where in Rome they gazed upon these sacred objects, but it would have been in the site known as the Temple of Peace. And if the rabbis refuse to give the edifice its appellation, it's surely because they realize its profound and painful irony. This is called the Temple of Peace. But what it is actually is a place where everyone can come and see all that Rome has taken from Judea, which was brutally destroyed. It's akin today to the United Nations, where we can see an institution such as the United Nations Human Rights Commission, whose title ostensibly embodies an aspiration to peace, but is actually a forum for warmongering tyrannies to make anti-Semitism manifest. So too, for the first few centuries of the Common Era, Jews in ancient times could ponder the suffering, the massacre, and the exile of their ancestors, and the hatred that was directed at them by visiting a building known as the Temple of Peace. And this highlights an important difference between Israel and its enemies, both ancient and modern. Oxford professor Martin Goodman wrote an excellent book where he describes the contrast between the Jewish and Roman cultures at the time of the Second Temple's destruction. Goodman notes that Jews, like Romans, recognize the reality of war and its necessity, but at the same time, he continues, Jews have been careful never to idealize warfare and have avoided glorifications of military might as an end in itself. He writes that, quote, Jews, as much as Romans, viewed war as a natural condition, but unlike Romans, they sometimes expressed a hope that this might change, end quote. Despite all the very violent exhortations in the Hebrew Bible, Goodman writes, nevertheless, quote, the biblical prophets Isaiah, Micah, and Joel all looked forward with longing to a time when there would be no more war at all, end quote. Thus, the famous words of Isaiah's eschatological vision, and he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. While the manifestation of military might has its place in the Jewish tradition, that was never the ultimate goal, and this, Goodman notes, was one of the great differences between the Jews and the Romans, or as he puts it, quote, this notion of peace, shalom, and an end to war espoused by Isaiah was quite different from the Roman notion of pax, which constituted little more than a pause to take stock between victorious and glorious campaigns, end quote. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Rome saw nothing strange in celebrating their brutal conquests in a temple of peace. Because war was the object. War was inevitable. The temple to Pax would allow them to celebrate their victories and rest so that more war and more victories could follow. For Jews, the opposite is true. War is important at times, essential, but never an end in itself. And to my knowledge, the most eloquent expression of this Jewish worldview in modern times was Menachem Begin's 1978 speech in Oslo, after he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The speech began in Begin's usual classy way. Right before Begin had left for Oslo, and right before her own passing, Golda Meir had remarked that, quote, Begin did not deserve a Nobel Prize, he deserved an Oscar. And what she meant by that is that, in her view, Begin did not truly aspire to peace. Now, this was, of course, utterly unfair. But by the time Begin had arrived in Norway, Golda Meir had died, and Begin, gentleman as he always was, began by celebrating his predecessors, saying at the start, quote, I ask for permission first to pay tribute to Golda Meir, my predecessor, a great leader and prime minister who strove with all her heart to achieve peace between Israel and her neighbors. Her blessed memory will live forever in the hearts of the Jewish people and of all peace-loving nations. And then, Begin addressed the virtue for which he was being awarded, peace. It was the Jews, Begin noted, who bestowed the very notion of peace upon the world, who gave their vision through Isaiah to the world. Here is how he put it, quote, the ancient Jewish people gave the world the vision of eternal peace, of universal disarmament, of abolishing the teaching and learning of war. Two prophets, Yeshayahu ben Amoz, that's Isaiah, and Micha HaMorashti, having foreseen the spiritual unity of man under God with his word coming forth from Jerusalem, gave the nations of the world the following vision expressed in identical terms, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And then Begin added his own small reflection on peace. He said, despite the tragedies and disappointments of the past, we must never forsake that vision, that human dream, that unshakable faith. Peace is the beauty of life. It is sunshine. It is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family. It is the advancement of man, the victory of a just cause. the triumph of truth. Peace, said Begin. Peace is all of these and more and more. Now, Begin, of course, understood that those assembled in that auditorium did not necessarily see him as a man of peace, but as a fighter. He therefore reminded them implicitly of the fact that he, who had just said that peace is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family, he himself had had his own family destroyed, his father and mother murdered, that the world had done nothing to stop it, and that this had taught him that at times evil had to be fought before peace was possible. Begin added in part, quote, "But in my generation, ladies and gentlemen, there was a time indescribable. 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, a number larger than many a nation in Europe, were dragged to a wanton death and slaughtered methodically in the heart of the civilized continent." And he added, "Other than a few famous and unforgettable exceptions, they were left alone to face the destroyer. At such a time, unheard of since the first generation, the hour struck to rise and fight for the dignity of man, for survival, for liberty, for every value of the human image a man has been endowed with by his Creator, for every known inalienable right he stands for and lives for. Indeed," Begin added, "there are days when to fight for a cause so absolutely just is the highest human command. Norway," he said, "has known such days, and so have we. Only," Begin concluded, "only in honoring that command comes the regeneration of the concept of peace. Let it, however, be declared and known, stressed and noted, that fighters for freedom hate war." This is Begin. War for Jews is at times necessary, but never something beloved. Peace is an aspiration. And this marks a contrast to our enemies. The Romans looked forward to the next war. Jews fought, but longed for peace. So too, Israel today defends itself, battles its enemies, but does not celebrate the war. Meanwhile, enemies such as Hezbollah described its own aims and aspirations as follows, quote, "We have discovered how to hit the Jews where they are the most vulnerable. The Jews love life, so that is what we shall take away from them. We are going to win because we love death and they love life," end quote. Those are Hezbollah's words. And so, pondering Begin's Nobel speech, I realized that there is an even more painful irony to the fact that the treasures of Jerusalem's temple were placed in an edifice that the Romans called the Temple of Peace. Because the Jewish view of war and peace, as eloquently articulated by Begin, this vision was actually best embodied by our temple, by the Jewish temple, and by Jerusalem in its totality. The edifice known as the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, was the dream of David. Building it was the summit of his hopes, but this was denied by God because, as David himself says in Chronicles, David had been a man of war. But this, ladies and gentlemen, does not mean that David's battles were wrong. We celebrate the fact that David courageously defended the Jewish people, defended the people of Israel. We celebrate the fact that David courageously and brilliantly defended the people of Israel against its enemies. But part of David's greatness lay in the fact that he never allowed war, the wars he waged, to be glorified as an end in itself. And therefore, had David concluded his career by building what would inevitably have been seen as a monument to his might, had Israel's greatest warrior built a temple, then the Israelites might have been tempted to see David's lifetime endeavors of battle as achievements to glorify and events to celebrate, on par with their worship of the divine. Thus David's dream was denied, lest Judea become Rome, lest David become seen like Vespasian, who had constructed a Colosseum as an eternal testament to his own conquests. God's temple in Jerusalem would be built by David's son Solomon, Shlomo, whose name, like that of Jerusalem, is rooted in shalom, peace. And this clarifies the ultimate purpose of all of David's efforts, including his military triumphs, that our ultimate aspiration is that expressed by Isaiah. When Jerusalem is redeemed and is the dwelling place of the divine, When all nations will come to the mountain of God, beat their swords into plowshares, when from Zion shall go forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Jerusalem, in its totality, is the tale of David's military defense of Israel, but also its ultimate yearning for peace. And our temple that once crowned Jerusalem is the true temple of peace. And the career of the one Israeli prime minister that is buried next to the city of David reflects that prime minister's willingness to wage war for his people, but also his ultimate aspiration for peace. In reading Begin's citation of Isaiah in his Nobel presentation, I realized why these words were so fitting. Isaiah's vision of a world at peace, of a Jerusalem redeemed, of the nations streaming to hear the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, is the second chapter in his prophetic book. It's therefore, in spirit, it would seem to be the thematic opposite of Isaiah's first chapter, which is known as Chazon, Isaiah's vision of Jerusalem's destruction, which Jews read in advance of the 9th of Av, when the loss of the temple is mourned. Isaiah chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 2, the memory of Jewish destruction and the ultimate aspirations and hopes for the Jewish faith and for redemption and for Jerusalem. These two go hand in hand. Menachem Begin reflected this joining from his birth, for he was born immediately after Tisha B'Av, after the 9th of Av, when Jews mourned for Jerusalem, and he was named Menachem for consolation, because and thereby embodying in his name the faith expressed by Jews in future return and redemption. Begin in his own life always united what the 9th of Av embodied and what the faith in future consolation represented. In his own career and worldview, he never forgot family and city of Jews murdered in the horror of the Holocaust. And he also never forgot their faith in the future as he fought to help bring the Jewish return to the land of Israel and Jerusalem into being. This memory of the past and joining it to the future fueled Begin's fight for the people of Israel. And it fueled his belief that only if he remembered the past would he be reminded of the necessity at times of war on behalf of the Jewish people. And that only if this was remembered could peace ultimately be achieved. When Begin, as prime minister, went on Meet the Press and was asked about his meeting with President Carter and the agenda for peace, Begin immediately responded, quote, "With your permission, before I answer this very important question, I would like to say a few words about the day we now meet because of its universal importance. Today, in accordance with our calendar, is the 9th of the month of Av. It is the day when 1,907 years ago, the Roman legions, the 5th and the 12th, launched their ultimate onslaught on the Temple Mountain, set this temple ablaze and destroyed Jerusalem, subjugating our people and conquering our land. Historically," Begin said, "this is the beginning of all the suffering of our people, dispersed, humiliated, and ultimately now a generation physically destroyed." Begin then said, on Meet the Press, "We remember that day and now have the responsibility to make sure that never again will our independence be destroyed, and never again will the Jew become homeless or defenseless. Actually," he said, "this is the crux of the problems facing us in the future." This was Menachem Begin, the man who never forgot what Tisha B'Av, what the 9th of Av meant, the man whose name was linked to the 9th of Av, and the man who ultimately also became a peacemaker. The man who never forgot the past, but who always, always also linked memories of the past with hope for and faith in the Jewish future. The first chapter of Isaiah embodies all the tragedies and trauma of the centuries, and that is what the 9th of Av is about. But the chapter immediately after, with its vision of a redeemed Jerusalem, reminds us of how our own ancestors' faith in the future endured, and therefore how our own people endured. To ponder these two chapters of destruction and redemption is to ponder the miracle of the Jewish people, and ultimately of the miracle embodied by the eternity of Jewish Jerusalem. Cambridge historian Simon Goldhill, in his own book on Rome and in his own book on Jerusalem, in a reflection on Rome and Judea, tells us the following story from the Second Temple. Quote, "There is a pleasingly knowing story about Pompeii, the Roman general who marched into Jerusalem in 63 BC after a 3-month siege. With the bluff disregard of local sympathies that made the Romans what they were and has all too often characterized the rulers of Jerusalem, he walked straight into the Holy of Holies. This sacred space could not be entered except by the high priest, with many ritual precautions on one day of the year, the holiest of days, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But Pompey walked straight in, we are told, to see what he no doubt expected to be a glorious statue to match the significance of the temple for the Jewish people. Romans, Goldhill writes, regularly took cult statues of other cultures and transported them back to Rome in triumphant appropriation. He was amazed, Goldhill writes, Pompey was amazed, to find nothing there and remained baffled by the whole experience. This story, Goldhill writes, is told by Tacitus, the Roman historian, but it is retold by Jews. History is not always controlled by the victors. The contrast of the emptiness of the shrine and the practical man of war's confusion is eloquent, and for once allows the non-material its moment of assertion over the powerful realities of war and conquest, end quote. And so to stand at the grave of Menachem Begin and to study from that site a Jewish Jerusalem is to think of a man whose moral vision always joined the destruction of the past, and the faith is to think of a man whose moral vision always joined the memory of the destructions of the past and the faith in the future eternity of the Jewish people. Several hundred years after its construction in ancient Rome, the site known as the Temple of Peace, which contained the treasures of Jerusalem, seems to have caught fire. According to some ancient source, this was caused by a bolt of lightning. In Googling the Temple of Peace, I discovered a headline describing how Rome, in 2015, marking some anniversary, decided to, quote-unquote, restore the Temple of Peace. So I was immediately interested. What did that mean they were going to restore the Temple of Peace? Were they somehow going to bring back the menorah and other treasures of the temple back to the Temple of Peace and put everything on display? No. The article essentially explained that all they would do is bring back several columns that used to exist. Otherwise, the temple would look as it is, a ruin. What had been built to celebrate Rome's power and conquest is now a testament to its own destruction. There may be no better embodiment of Israel's endurance versus that of Rome than the fact that the Temple of Peace that Rome built is now in pieces. Or perhaps one greater reflection of Jewish eternity is the fact that a man named Menachem, consolation, a man who experienced so many ninth of Avs in his own life, stood later in life as prime minister of a Jewish state before an international audience in Oslo and proudly spoke both of Jewish suffering and of the prophetic vision and all that the Jewish people gave to the world. Today, in the midst of so many miracles, the 9th of Av, to which Begin's name was linked, is still a day of Jewish mourning. We mourn the fact that the eschatological age described in Isaiah is not yet upon us, and we mourn as well because we know that if peace, as Begin said, is the togetherness of a family, the smile of a mother, the joy of a father, we mourn because we know of so many families like Menachem Begin's, where a mother's smile, a father's joy, a family's togetherness was destroyed forever. Menachem Begin has taught us that it is our suffering over the centuries that has led us to treasure peace, but has also led us to understand the necessity of fighting evil and defeating evil. We mourn, in other words, because we owe it to our people, to all the generations before, to feel their suffering with them, to mourn with them, to make their losses ours, and to treasure their hopes and their dreams, so many of which were shattered. And we know from Begin that only if we learn from their experiences and fight evil, and also fight on behalf of the Jewish people, only then can peace be ultimately achieved. This is the essence of Begin's moral vision, and this is how Begin concluded his own address on peace in Oslo. Remembering all those who had gone before, he said as follows: "Allow me now to turn to you, Madam President of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, and to all its members and say, thank you. I thank you for the great distinction. It does not, however, belong to me. It belongs to my people, the ancient people and renaissance nation that came back in love and devotion to the land of its ancestors after centuries of homelessness and persecution. This prestigious recognition is due to this people because they suffered so much, because they lost so many, because they love peace and want it with all their hearts." The Talmud tells us that once a bridge spanned the valley between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives, connecting the two. Menachem Begin was the greatest Jewish statesman of the 20th century because he was himself a bridge between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem, between the longing and sufferings of the Jewish past and the faith in the Jewish future, between past destruction and future return, and between the necessity of war and the aspiration for peace. And it is in pondering the significance of where he lies buried that we discover why in our own minds and hearts Menachem Begin will never die. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Soloveichik, for concluding this symposium with such inspiring words, reminding us just what made Menachem Begin such an example of moral leadership. I want to thank all of our speakers and contributors today. You have helped to deepen our understanding of Begin's legacy and demonstrated just how he has inspired so many Israelis and Jews around the world. I would like to extend a special appreciation to President Rivlin for sharing such a beautiful and personal remarks. As President Rivlin's tenure is shortly coming to an end, this is an opportunity to thank him for over 4 decades of serving the State of Israel in different public capacities, including at the Knesset and government. A true Beitari, like Menachem Begin, he is a Democrat for whom the human dignity and equality of every person, as a person, is in his soul. A young boy who witnessed the miracle of establishing a home for the Jewish people, for whom making this dream a vibrant reality became his life's mission. Thank you, President Rivlin, for everything you have done. And to you, I want to thank all of you, our audience from around the world, for being with us today. We already have a date set for our next year's symposium, and we hope you will join us for that one in person, here at the Begin Center in Jerusalem. Make a note in your calendars already. The Begin Symposium 2022 will be held on the 13th and 14th of March, just a week after we mark 30 years since Menachem Begin's passing. And of course, the doors of the Begin Center are now finally open, and we would love to see every one of you anytime you're in Jerusalem. We also have a weekly live event on Zoom in English every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. in Israel. That's 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This Wednesday, you can hear from Dr. Sarah Foyer on how Israel's recent operation against Hamas in Gaza has affected the wider Middle East. Details are on our website and Facebook. A final thank you to everyone involved in making this symposium happen, including my amazing staff, and of course, all of our sponsors and generous supporters. Shalom, ולהתראות בירושלים.